The man grabbed Lydia's arm so hard she felt the bone flex. He didn't whisper. He didn't warn. He leaned in close enough that she could smell the whiskey soaked into his beard and said, flat as a headstone, "You walk through that door, girl, and you walk out owing me everything." The stagecoach office was full of people. Not one of them moved. She was 23 years old, she had $4 sewn into her hem, and the only thing waiting behind her was a factory floor that had already taken 2 of her fingers and was working on the rest of her life. So she pulled her arm free, it cost her skin, and she walked through that door. That was the moment everything changed. And she didn't even know yet that she was walking straight toward a man everyone in the territory was afraid of. If you've ever had to choose between one danger and another, if you know what it feels like to have no good option, only the least terrible one, then this story is for you. Stay with us all the way to the end, because what Lydia Ashcroft found on the other side of that door will stay with you long after the story is over. Subscribe to our channel right now so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, which was already suspicious because nothing good ever came on a Tuesday. Lydia found it tucked beneath the door of the boarding house room she shared with 2 other mill girls, a woman named Doris, who snored like a saw blade hitting a nail, and a 16-year-old from County Cork who cried herself to sleep every night without ever explaining why. The envelope was plain, the handwriting severe and economical, like whoever wrote it didn't believe in wasting ink. The return address said only S. Thorne, Iron Hollow, Wyoming Territory. She didn't know anyone in Wyoming. She'd barely known there was a Wyoming. She almost threw it away. She would spend the next 8 months grateful she hadn't. Inside was a single folded page, and the letter was not what she expected from a matrimonial advertisement. There were no flowery promises, no flattery, no description of a paradise waiting for her beyond the Mississippi. The man, this S. Thorne, wrote the way someone talks when they've already had too many people lie to them. "I am a rancher. I have land and cattle and a house that keeps the weather out. I need a wife who can work and who won't run the first time something goes wrong. I am not an easy man. I won't pretend to be. What I can offer is this: safety, a roof, enough food, and my word that no one will ever put their hands on you in my house. If that sounds like something worth considering, write back. If it doesn't, I understand." That was it, the entire letter. Lydia read it 3 times, sitting on the edge of her cot, and somewhere around the second reading, something in her chest did a thing she couldn't quite name. Not hope exactly. More like recognition, like someone had finally described her life in honest language instead of dressing it up in words that made it sound better than it was. She was not, and had never been, a woman who expected things to be handed to her. Her parents were both dead by the time she was 14, her father taken by a lung fever that the mill refused to acknowledge was caused by the cotton dust, her mother gone 2 years later from something the doctor called exhaustion, and Lydia called something else entirely. She'd been working the looms since she was 11. She'd lost the tip of her ring finger to a machine that didn't care, and a foreman who cared even less. She had $4, a Bible she never opened, 2 dresses, and a boarding house room that cost her 30 cents a night she could barely afford. The marriage advertisement she'd answered, she wasn't proud of it, but she wasn't ashamed either, had been posted in the back of a women's gazette, sandwiched between a cure for rheumatism and an advertisement for corsets. "Gentleman of the frontier seeks wife of good character for honest partnership." She'd replied on a Wednesday with a letter that was probably too blunt. She said she wasn't beautiful, she wasn't delicate, she'd never learned to play piano, and she had no family money. What she had was a strong back, a willingness to learn whatever needed learning, and no illusions about what marriage meant in practical terms. She figured if that wasn't what he wanted, better to know it now than after she'd already crossed half the country. She hadn't really expected him to write back. The day she told the foreman she was leaving, he laughed. He had a particular kind of laugh that men like him deploy specifically to make a woman feel foolish, and he used it on Lydia without mercy. "Going west, are you? To marry some dirt farmer you've never laid eyes on? That's the plan?" "Yes," she said. "And what happens when he's a drunk, or a criminal, or worse?" She picked up her lunch pail. "Then I'll figure something out." She walked out before he could say anything else, which was the first genuinely satisfying thing she'd done in 3 years. What she didn't know, what nobody thought to tell her until it was too late to matter, was that S. Thorne was not a name that strangers in Wyoming said without lowering their voice first. The stagecoach from Cheyenne to Iron Hollow took 2 days, and Lydia spent most of those 2 days watching other passengers find reasons to get off before the final stop. A traveling salesman named Mr. Pruitt, heavy-set, cheerful, smelling of bay rum, sat across from her for the first several hours and talked enough for both of them. He sold farm equipment. He'd made the route 6 times. He knew everyone. When she told him who she was going to marry, he stopped talking. "Say that again," he said. "Silas Thorne. He's a rancher outside Iron Hollow." Pruitt looked at her the way doctors look at people when they're deciding how much to say. "You know him?" "Not yet. We've exchanged letters." "Just letters." "Just letters." He turned and looked out the window for a long moment. Then he turned back, and whatever cheerfulness he'd been carrying seemed to have gotten off at the last stop along with his sales pitch. "Miss Ashcroft," he said carefully, "Silas Thorne is not a man I'd send anyone toward without fair warning." She kept her expression even. She'd spent years learning to keep her expression even. "What kind of warning?" Pruitt chose his word the way you choose your footing crossing a frozen river. "He's not a drunk. He's not a thief. But there are men buried in that territory because of Silas Thorne, and every one of them knew what they were getting into before they got into it. He's got a reputation for—" He stopped. Started again. "He's got a reputation." "For what specifically?" "Violence." The word sat in the coach between them like something with weight. "Self-defense?" she asked. "Sometimes. And sometimes maybe a little more than that." He shook his head. "I'm not saying he's a murderer. I'm saying he's a man who has killed people, and he's not ashamed of it, and that's a particular kind of person that most folks give a wide berth." Lydia nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." "You're going anyway." It wasn't a question, but she answered it. "I don't have anywhere else to go." He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been respect or pity or some uncomfortable combination of both. Then he turned back to the window, and they didn't speak again for the rest of the day. That night, at the way station where the passengers slept on cots in a single room, divided by a curtain that provided approximately no privacy, Lydia lay on her back staring at the planks above her and thought about what she was actually doing. She was not naive. She had never had the luxury of being naive. She knew that a man who advertised for a wife through a newspaper, who lived alone in an isolated territory, who was described by strangers with that particular careful quietness, she knew that man was carrying something heavy, something that hadn't healed right. She also knew that she was carrying her own weight, her own scars, her own things that hadn't healed right. The question wasn't whether Silas Thorne was a dangerous man. The question was whether he was dangerous to her specifically. And somehow, reading his letter again in her head, "No one will ever put their hands on you in my house," she found herself believing that he meant it. She was probably a fool. She went to sleep anyway. Iron Hollow was smaller than she'd imagined and harder looking. The kind of settlement that seemed to have been built purely out of necessity with no concessions made to anything else. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that looked like it had survived several fires and was currently surviving at least one slow leak, and a scattering of homes that sat at careful distances from each other, like people who'd had one bad argument and hadn't entirely gotten over it. The stagecoach pulled up in front of the general store, and Lydia stepped down carrying a bag that held everything she owned. And she stood there in the afternoon light and looked around and felt the specific loneliness of arriving somewhere new and realizing you don't know a single face. There were people on the street, 2 women talking in front of the dry goods, a man in an apron sweeping a porch, 3 men outside the saloon who stopped talking the moment the coach arrived and watched her the way horses watch something they're not sure about yet. She was looking for Silas Thorne. She didn't know what he looked like. His letters had contained no description of himself, and she hadn't thought to ask, which now seemed like an oversight. So she was watching faces, trying to find one that matched the voice she'd constructed in her head from his writing. What she found instead was a woman about her own age, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, stepping off the general store porch and walking toward her with the particular directness of someone who has decided something. "You're the bride," the woman said, not unkindly, but also not gently. "Lydia Ashcroft." "Clara Holt. My husband runs the livery." She looked Lydia over in a single comprehensive glance. Silas sent word you were coming today. He doesn't come into town much. He asked me to let you know he'd be here within the hour. Thank you. Clara hesitated. Something moved behind her eyes. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Did anyone warn you? About Silas, I mean, before you came. Lydia thought of Pruitt on the stagecoach, of the other passenger who'd gone pale and gotten off 3 stops early the moment she'd mentioned the name. Yes, she said, more than one person. Clara nodded slowly. And you came anyway? I came anyway. The woman studied her for a moment longer and then did something Lydia hadn't expected. She smiled, small and a little sad and entirely genuine. Well, she said, I hope you're as tough as you look, because this town has been watching Silas Thorne for 15 years, waiting for him to fall apart, and nobody's seen it happen yet, and you're about to become the thing everybody watches him protect. She picked up Lydia's bag before Lydia could reach for it. Come inside, have some coffee. You look like you haven't eaten since Cheyenne. She was right. Lydia followed her in. He arrived 53 minutes later. She knew it was him before Clara said a word, before the door even opened, because the room changed. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in stories where candles flicker and dogs go quiet. It was subtler than that. The 2 men drinking coffee at the counter simply stopped talking. One of them turned to look at the door. The other one deliberately did not. Silas Thorne was not what she'd built in her imagination. She'd expected something imposing and rough and immediately frightening. The physical embodiment of his reputation, a man who looked like violence the way some men look like authority. What she got was tall, yes, and lean in the way that people who do physical work in hard climates get lean, and dark in coloring, with weathered skin and hands that showed the work they'd done. But his face was something she hadn't expected. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even cold exactly. It was exhausted. That was what struck her first and stayed with her longest. Not the scar that ran from his jaw toward his left ear, not the way he moved with the particular careful economy of someone who has had too many fights to waste motion, not the way his eyes swept the room before they found her. Old habit, she'd come to learn, left over from years when walking into a room and not checking it first could get you killed. What struck her was how tired he looked. Tired the way stone gets tired, slowly, over a very long time, under a great deal of pressure. He crossed the room and stopped 2 feet away from her, and they looked at each other for a long moment, and she thought, this is the man I agreed to marry. This is actually happening. Miss Ashcroft, he said. His voice was low and even and carried no inflection she could read yet. Mr. Thorne. He didn't offer his hand. She didn't offer hers. They just looked at each other, doing the particular math that strangers do when they're trying to figure out who they're actually dealing with. The ride was all right, he asked. Long, she said, and educational. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, more like the ghost of acknowledgement. People talk. They do. What did they say? She held his gaze. That you're a feared man, that you've killed people, that I was making a mistake. He didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself. He just nodded, once, the way someone nods when they're confirming information they already knew. That's all accurate, he said. More or less? More or less, she repeated. The mistake part is up for debate. She picked up her bag, the one Clara had set down beside her. I suppose we'll find out. He looked at her for another moment, that same comprehensive, unreadable assessment, and then turned toward the door. I've got the wagon outside. It's an hour and a half to the ranch. A pause. There's a blanket in the back. It'll get cold. I'll be fine. He glanced back at her once, and she couldn't entirely read what was in his eyes. Something between assessment and something else. Something quieter. Then he pushed through the door, and she followed him into the late afternoon light. Clara caught her arm just before the threshold, gentle but firm, leaned close. You know what he said when I asked him why he wanted a wife? She whispered. Lydia shook her head. He said, because I'm tired of being the only one who knows what it costs. Clara released her arm, stepped back. I don't know what that means exactly, but I thought you should have it. Lydia stood in the doorway for one single second. The man was already at the wagon, untying the reins, not looking back to see if she was following. Not certain she would be. She thought of the factory floor, of the foreman's laugh, of the letter with its plain handwriting and its single honest promise. No one will ever put their hands on you in my house. She walked out into the cold Wyoming light and climbed up onto the wagon seat beside a man whose past was darker than anything she'd ever touched, and whose face in the fading afternoon looked exactly like someone who had stopped hoping for things and hadn't quite figured out what to replace hope with. The wagon rolled out of Iron Hollow. The three men in front of the saloon watched it go. Nobody said a word. The road west was empty and long, and the wind came down out of the mountains like something with intention. And beside her, Silas Thorne kept his eyes on the horizon and said nothing. And Lydia Ashcroft sat with her hands in her lap and her spine straight and the $4 still sewn into her hem and thought, well, here we are. She didn't know yet what was waiting for her out in that wilderness. She didn't know what it would cost her to stay. She didn't know that by the time winter came, she would understand exactly what he'd meant, what it costs. And she would understand why he'd been carrying it alone for so long, and why that had been slowly, quietly, breaking something in him that hadn't broken yet but would have. She didn't know any of that. What she knew was that she'd made her choice, and the road behind her was already gone around the bend, and the only direction left was forward. The wagon kept moving, the wind kept coming, and Silas Thorne, without looking at her, reached under the seat and pulled out the wool blanket he'd mentioned and held it toward her without a word. She took it, pulled it around her shoulders, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, no one told her what to do with it. The ranch was not what she'd expected, which was becoming a pattern with everything connected to Silas Thorne. She'd prepared herself for something bleak. A bachelor's neglect, dishes stacked in corners, mud tracked through every room, the particular disorder of a man who had given up on the idea that spaces were meant to be lived in rather than just occupied. What she found instead was a house that was spare and clean in the way that military things are clean. Not comfortable, not warm, but ordered. Everything had a place. Everything was in it. The floors were swept. The windows, though small, were clear. There was a woodpile stacked beside the back door that reached the eave and was split with the precise consistency of someone who found meaning in the work itself, not just the result. She stood in the main room with her bag at her feet and looked around and tried to understand the man through the space he'd built, the way you read a person's handwriting before you know them well enough to read their face. "The bedroom's there," Silas said from behind her, nodding toward a closed door. "I'll take the loft." She turned. "That's your bedroom." "Was," he said, simply, like the matter was already settled. "I'm not putting you out of your own room." He looked at her steadily. "Miss Ashcroft, I've slept on harder ground than that loft for longer stretches than you'd believe. I'm not putting you in a loft your first night in a strange place. Take the room." He picked up her bag. She reached for it at the same time, and their fingers almost touched, and they both stepped back slightly, a fraction of an inch. The unconscious negotiation of two people who don't yet know where the other one's edges are. He set the bag near the bedroom door and didn't look at her again. "There's stew on the stove. It's been on since noon, so it's probably too thick, but it's food." It was too thick. She ate 2 bowls. He ate standing at the kitchen window looking out at the dark, which told her something, though she wasn't sure yet what. They didn't talk much. He answered what she asked, how many cattle, how many acres, whether there was a well or whether she'd need to carry water from the creek. And she answered what he asked, which was less. He wanted to know if she could ride. She told him she'd ridden some but not well. He nodded, said he'd show her the basics in the morning, that the horse he had in mind for her was opinionated but not mean. "Opinionated," she repeated. "She'll test you. Once. If you hold your ground, she'll be fine." Lydia looked at him. "Is that your experience with most things? Test once, then settle?" He met her eyes across the kitchen, and something moved in his expression. Not quite humor, but adjacent to it. The place where humor used to live before whatever had happened to him had moved in instead. "Most things," he said. Then he rinsed his bowl, set it on the drying rack, and climbed the ladder to the loft without another word. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after she heard the creak of the loft board settle into silence. She was tired from the road, and her back ached and her feet hurt, and she was sitting in a stranger's kitchen in a territory she'd never seen before, about to sleep in a stranger's bed, about to begin a life she'd agreed to on the basis of a single letter and $4 sewn into her hem. She wasn't afraid exactly, but she wasn't not afraid either. She blew out the lamp and went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to Wyoming breathe outside the window, wind and distance, and the occasional sound of an animal she couldn't identify. And she thought, one day at a time. That's how it gets done. One day at a time. She was asleep before she finished the thought. The first week was about logistics, which was its own kind of mercy because logistics didn't require them to talk about anything real. He showed her the horse, a gray mare named, inexplicably, Senator, and the mare did exactly what he'd predicted, planting her feet and rolling one dark, suspicious eye at Lydia. The first morning, while Lydia stood her ground and looked back, and after about 45 seconds, the horse sighed the enormous theatrical sigh of an animal that has decided to be gracious about losing and let herself be saddled. Silas watched this from the fence rail with his arms folded and said nothing, but she noticed he'd stopped chewing on the piece of straw he'd been working. He showed her how the smokehouse worked, where the root cellar was, which boards on the back porch were rotted through and needed avoiding. He showed her the property lines, not with any particular pride, just factually, the way you show someone a map. East to the creek, north to the ridge, west to the stand of cottonwood that marked where his land ended and the open range began. South was a long slope of grass that in the early morning light looked like something a painter would be tempted by, though she didn't say that because it seemed like the kind of observation that might land strangely between them. On the third day she asked him about the scar. Not directly, she wasn't that forward yet, but she'd asked Clara the previous afternoon when she'd ridden into Iron Hollow for supplies, alone, which felt important, a small insistence on her own capability. And Clara had looked at her teacup and said, "The war. He was in it young, came back, different. Then he came west and there were other troubles, land troubles, the kind that gets settled with guns out here." She'd paused. "A man named Garrett Cole was involved. That's all I'll say about that because the rest of it isn't mine to tell." Garrett Cole. She filed the name away and didn't ask Silas about it. Not yet. What she asked instead, on the third evening when they were both tired and the fire was low, and the particular exhaustion of hard work had softened whatever walls they maintained during the day, was, "Did you always want to ranch?" He was mending a piece of harness, his hands moving with the automatic ease of something he'd done 10,000 times. He didn't look up right away. "No," he said. "What did you want?" A long pause. The fire shifted. Outside, the wind was doing its usual thing with the cottonwoods, that low rushing sound that she was slowly learning to find calming rather than lonely. "I was going to study law," he said, "before the war." She hadn't expected that. Law. "My father was a lawyer, small town in Virginia. I was going to read for him." He kept his eyes on the harness. "Then the war happened, and after the war my father was dead and the town was—" He stopped. Started again differently. "I came west because there was nothing behind me worth staying for." "And you found this?" "Found enough to do with my hands that I didn't have too much time to think." He finally looked up, briefly. "That's not the same as wanting it." "No," she agreed, "but sometimes it's enough." He held her gaze for a second longer than he had before. Then he went back to the harness. But something had shifted, some almost imperceptible degree, in the space between them. Not warmth exactly. More like the first evidence that warmth might be possible, somewhere down the road, if neither of them ruined it first. She ruined it on day 11. She'd been trying to fix a gap in the chicken coop. The hens were new, purchased from a neighbor 2 miles east, and one of them had already found the gap and exploited it twice. And she'd borrowed tools from the barn without asking, which she'd assumed was fine, which it turned out was not an assumption she should have made without confirmation. She didn't know the toolbox had a system. She didn't know that Silas maintained it with the same rigid logic he applied to everything else in his life, that every tool had a specific place and the specific place mattered. She found out because he came into the barn while she was working, and the look on his face when he saw the open toolbox with 3 things missing from their spots was not anger exactly, but something that moved through him fast and left him rigid for a second before he got it back under control. "I should have asked," she said immediately. "Yes." Flat, controlled, the kind of controlled that costs something. "I'm sorry, I didn't think—" "It's fine." He crossed the barn and picked up the tools she'd left on the workbench and put them back in their places without looking at her. His movements were too precise. She recognized it from the factory floor. The deliberate physical control of someone managing something internal that they don't want anyone else to see. She could have left it there. Probably should have. "What happens," she said carefully, "when you can't find a tool?" He went still. "I'm not picking a fight," she said. "I genuinely want to know, because something about that box matters to you, and I don't want to make this mistake again." The silence stretched. Then he said without turning around, "After the war, there were times when—" He stopped. His hand rested on the workbench, flat. "Control is a habit. You build it when everything outside you is chaos. The box it's nothing. It's just a box." "It's not nothing," she said quietly. "It's the thing that stays the same." He turned then, looked at her. And whatever he'd been expecting her to say, it hadn't been that. Because for a moment his face did something it hadn't done in her presence before. It opened, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, like a window in a closed room when someone puts their hand on the latch. Then it closed again. "I'll show you where everything goes," he said. "Thank you." They spent 20 minutes in the barn while he walked her through the toolbox with the same thorough economy he'd used to show her the property lines, and she paid attention and asked no other questions. And when they were done, he went back to the cattle and she went back to the chicken coop, and the gap got fixed properly this time. That night she heard him in the loft for a long time before he went still. She lay in the dark and thought about what he'd said. Control is a habit. You build it when everything outside you is chaos. She thought about how long a person could hold that kind of habit before the habit became the only thing holding them together. She thought about the war and the father who was dead and the town that was gone and whatever had happened with Garrett Cole that Clara wouldn't say. She thought, this man has been holding himself together for a very long time, and it has cost him almost everything, and he has done it alone, and I am the first person in years who sleeps in this house. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that, but she didn't forget it. The first time she heard about Garrett Cole directly was 5 weeks in, and it came from a man she'd never seen before and hoped never to see again. She'd been in town for the weekly supply run, something she did alone now as a matter of course, and she was loading flour sacks into the back of the wagon in front of the general store when a man stopped on the boardwalk and looked at her with the specific, assessing look that she recognized from her factory days. The look that treated her less as a person and more as an object that might be useful. He was well dressed for the frontier, which she'd come to understand meant something. Money out here either came from cattle worked honestly or from something else. And this man's clothes didn't look like cattle money. He had a thick, dark mustache and pale eyes, and he stood with the ease of someone who had never in his adult life worried about whether he was allowed to be somewhere. "You'd be Thorne's wife," he said. Not a question. "I'd be Mrs. Thorne," she said. She kept loading flour. He stepped down off the boardwalk. She noticed, without letting herself react to it, that this put him between her and the driver's seat, not blocking her, just present. Interesting choice he made, bringing a woman out here. I imagine that's between him and me. Garrett Cole doesn't see it quite that way. She picked up the last flour sack and set it in the wagon and turned to face him directly, which seemed to mildly surprise him. "I don't know who Garrett Cole is," she said, "but I expect you're about to tell me." The man smiled. It didn't reach the pale eyes. "Cole owns most of the range east of the creek. He and Thorne have a history. Old business that never got fully settled." He tilted his head slightly. "Cole just wanted me to pass along his regards. And to mention that it's a shame when innocent parties get caught up in other people's disputes." The word innocent landed the way he'd intended it to, like a fingertip on a bruise. "You can tell Mr. Cole," Lydia said, "that Mrs. Thorne appreciates the concern and will be sure to pass it along to her husband." She held the man's eyes, who will no doubt have thoughts of his own about it. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. The man stepped back. The smile stayed, which was somehow worse than if it had dropped. "You've got nerve," he said, almost admiringly. "Hope it serves you well." She flicked the reins and Senator moved, and she kept her spine straight and her eyes forward until she turned the corner out of his line of sight, and then she let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest like a stone, and her hands shook very slightly on the reins for exactly long enough that she noticed them and stopped. She told Silas that evening. She told it plainly, without softening it, the way she figured it needed to be told. When she'd finished, she watched him. He was standing at the kitchen counter with a coffee cup he'd stopped drinking from 3 sentences in, and the stillness that came over him was different from his usual stillness. Not the controlled quiet of a man in charge of himself, but the kind of stillness that happens just before something moves. "Describe him," Silas said. She described him. Silas set the coffee cup down, carefully. "His name is Dylan Marsh. He works for Cole." I gathered he wasn't acting on his own initiative. "No." He turned to face her. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not fear, but something that sat between them, something protective and grim and very, very focused. "This is what I need you to understand. Cole and I have a history that started before you came here. He's been pushing at the edges of this property for 2 years. Up to now, it's been cattle, missing stock, cut fences, things I couldn't prove. This is different." "He sent a message through you," she said. "He used you to send a message." "Yes." His jaw tightened. "I should have warned you. I didn't think he'd—" He stopped. Something shifted. "I underestimated what having a wife would mean to a man like him." "What does it mean?" He met her eyes. "It means he thinks he's found the one thing that could make me reckless." The sentence sat in the air between them. "And could he?" she asked quietly. "Make you reckless?" The pause before he answered was long enough to tell her everything she needed to know about it. "That's what I'm working on," he said. Weeks turned and the land shifted with them, the summer heat giving way to something that smelled like autumn, even when it was still warm in the afternoons, and the cattle were fat, and the hay was in, and Lydia's hands had hardened in a different way than they'd hardened in the factory, a better way, a way that came from work that was hers rather than work that was taken from her. She learned to ride Senator properly, not just tolerably. She learned which stretches of fence line needed the most attention after a storm. She learned that Silas drank his coffee too hot and too strong, and always had, and that he woke before dawn every morning and sat on the porch for 20 minutes before he did anything else, just sat there in the dark with his coffee and whatever he carried, and she learned to leave that time alone because it was clearly the hinge of his day. She learned that he had a brother once. She learned this by accident, from a letter that arrived addressed to Silas that he read at the kitchen table and then sat with for a long time without moving, and when she asked, carefully, he said, "My brother's wife, letting me know he died in March." He folded the letter. "We hadn't spoken in 7 years. I'm sorry," she said. "We disagreed about the war." He set the letter on the table. "He thought I stayed in too long, after Appomattox." His voice was level, but she'd learned enough about his voice by now to hear what levelness cost him. He wasn't wrong. "Did you ever try to—" "I wrote him once, 4 years ago." He picked up his coffee. He didn't write back. He looked at her across the table. "Some things stay broken no matter what you do about them." She didn't argue with that. She thought about her own broken things. Her parents, the years in the factory that she would never get back, the girl she'd been at 17 who'd believed that working hard enough would be enough, and had been wrong in the most expensive way possible. "Yes," she said, "but some things look more broken than they are." He studied her. "You think so?" "I think the man who wrote me that letter, the first one, before I came, wasn't a man who'd given up on everything. A man who'd given up entirely doesn't bother to promise something to a stranger." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did I promise you?" "That no one would put their hands on me in your house." She held his gaze. "You've kept it." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the weight of it without feeling threatened by it, which itself felt like something significant, that she'd learned to tell the difference. "It wasn't a small thing to promise," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." They sat with that between them for a moment, this acknowledgement of what the promise had cost and what the keeping of it had meant, and it was the closest they'd come yet to talking about what was actually happening between them, which was not the practical partnership they'd both agreed to and was becoming something considerably more complicated, and neither of them was quite ready to name it out loud. "The fence on the north pasture needs attention," he said, changing the subject with the bluntness of a man who has decided a door needs closing. "I know," she said. "I noticed it yesterday." He nodded, drank his coffee, and she noticed that when he set the cup down, he set it slightly closer to the center of the table than his usual spot, which was toward his side, toward himself. And she thought about that later in the evening and thought it probably meant nothing, and then thought again and thought it probably meant something, and then decided she was going to stop reading meaning into where a man put his coffee cup and went to sleep. The night Silas Thorne said something kind to her for the first time, he didn't know he was doing it. It was raining, the kind of rain that the Wyoming fall delivers without apology, cold and driven sideways and carrying the first real reminder of winter. And she'd been out in it longer than she should have been because one of the hens had gotten loose again, a different hen from a different gap she hadn't found yet, and she'd finally caught it and fixed the gap in the dark and the rain and come inside soaked to the skin and furious with the hen, herself, and the rain in roughly equal measure. She was standing in the kitchen peeling off her soaked jacket when she heard him come down the ladder from the loft, something he didn't usually do once he'd gone up. And he came into the kitchen and took one look at her and went to the stove without a word and stoked it back up and put water on and went to the chest near the bedroom door and got a blanket and brought it to her. And she was too cold and tired to maintain any dignity about accepting it and just wrapped it around herself and stood next to the stove while he moved around the kitchen. "The red hen?" he asked. "How did you know it was the red one?" "Because she's done it before you got here." He set a cup in front of her. "Tea." He didn't drink tea himself, she'd noticed, but he kept it. She'd wondered about that. "There's a gap under the coop on the east side that I patched twice. It needs a proper board, not just wire." "I found it," she said. "Fixed it with what I had." He looked at her, at the mud on her hands and her hair flattened against her face and the blanket around her shoulders. "In this." The hen wasn't going to wait for morning. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're not what I expected." She looked up at him over the tea. "What did you expect?" He seemed to consider how to answer that honestly. "Someone who'd need more time," he said, "to settle in, to figure out if they wanted to stay." "Did you think I might leave?" "I thought it was possible." He sat down across from her, which he didn't usually do in the evenings, and she noticed it but didn't say anything. "Most people find this life harder than they thought it would be. Most people haven't worked a loom for 12 hours a day in a building with no windows," she said. Something moved through his eyes. Not pity, she'd have bristled at pity, but something more like understanding, recognition. The look of one person seeing another person's weight and not looking away from it. "No," he said, "I don't suppose they have." She drank her tea. He sat across from her and the stove ticked and the rain hit the window and outside was all weather and dark, and inside was warm and lit, and she was sitting across from a man who had frightened an entire territory and was currently watching her drink tea with an expression on his face that she could only describe as careful, like someone holding something fragile that they weren't entirely sure how they'd come to be holding. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. Nobody called him by his first name. She'd noticed. Even Clara called him Thorne. He didn't correct her. "Thank you," she said. "For the blanket. And the tea." He held her eyes for a second. "You shouldn't have been out in it that long." "Probably not." "The hen isn't worth getting sick over." "She's my hen," Lydia said. "If she's worth having, she's worth going after." The silence that followed was the kind that isn't uncomfortable. The kind that happens when two people have run out of words. Not because there's nothing to say, but because what's left to say is bigger than the space available for it, and they've mutually decided to leave it for another time. He stood up after a while, said goodnight, climbed back up to the loft. She sat with her tea until it was gone, listening to the rain slow down and then stop, and she thought about the look on his face, that careful, almost bewildered expression of a man holding something fragile. And she thought about how long he'd been alone in this house, in this territory, in this life he'd built not because he wanted it, but because it was what was left. She thought about Clara's words, that first day. He said he was tired of being the only one who knows what it costs. She was beginning to understand what he meant. And sitting there in the quiet after the rain, with the blanket around her shoulders and the stove warm beside her, she understood something else too. Something she hadn't planned on, hadn't been looking for, had arrived at the way you arrive at the edge of something high in the dark, not with a dramatic step, but with one ordinary step after another, until suddenly the ground is gone, and what's below you is vast, and you realize you've been walking toward it for longer than you knew. She was not falling in love with Silas Thorne the way people fall in love in stories, suddenly and completely and with certainty. She was doing it the way real things happen, slowly, crookedly, with doubt and hesitation and the constant nagging awareness that she might be wrong about all of it. But she was doing it. She went to bed and didn't sleep for a long time, and somewhere in the loft above her, she heard him turn over once and then go still. Cole made his next move on a cold Thursday morning in early October. She knew it was Cole before Silas said anything because of the way he looked when he came back from the north pasture. That particular rigid control, the flat mouth, the eyes that were working very hard at something internal and hadn't finished yet. He'd ridden hard. Senator was blowing and damp-sided in the yard. 30 head, he said when she met him at the door. North pasture, gone. Gone how? Driven off. Cut fence, horses, at least 4 riders. They knew what they were doing, and they knew where to go. He came inside. She stepped back to let him through without thinking about it. This isn't missing cattle anymore. What is it? He looked at her directly. It's a statement. She thought about Dylan Marsh in front of the general store with his pale eyes and his thin smile. It's a shame when innocent parties get caught up in other people's disputes. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to find out exactly how many I'm missing, and then I'm going to ride to Cole's south boundary and make clear that the next time is the last time. He paused. Something in his face shifted, and the shift wasn't the controlled blankness she'd gotten used to, but something rawer than that, something he was usually better at keeping away from the surface. I need you to know that this is going to get harder before it gets better. I know. If you want to go to Clara's, stay in town for a while, so... I don't. He studied her. Lydia. The name. He'd never used her first name before. It changed the shape of the sentence in a way neither of them commented on. Silas, she said back, same tone, and watched something flicker across his face. I'm not going to Clara's. I'm not going to sit in town and wonder what's happening here. I'm not built that way, and you knew it when you read my letter and wrote back. He was quiet for a moment. I did know it, he said. Then stop offering me the door. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds, and what moved through his expression during those 3 seconds was complicated and deep, and she didn't have names for all of it. But underneath everything else, underneath the worry and the tension and the grim knowledge of what was coming, there was something that looked like relief, like a man who'd spent years carrying something alone and had just been told for the first time that he didn't have to. He nodded. Once. All right, he said. He went back out to the yard to unsaddle Senator, and she stood at the window and watched him go and thought, whatever is coming, we will face it from the same side. She hadn't known 3 months ago that she would feel this way. She hadn't known a lot of things 3 months ago. She'd known $4 and a letter from a stranger and the specific desperate courage of someone with nothing left to protect. She knew considerably more now. She turned from the window and went to put coffee on, because whatever came next, it wasn't going to start with either of them running on empty, and that was the kind of thing she could do right now, and she had learned, in the factory, in the boarding house, in these months on the hardest land she'd ever seen, that the only real answer to what's coming is to be ready when it arrives. She put the coffee on. Outside, the wind came off the ridge with the first real taste of winter in it, and somewhere east of the creek, on land that bordered theirs, Garrett Cole sat in a warm house and planned his next move against a man he'd been trying to break for years, not knowing, not yet, that the one thing he'd meant to use as a weapon had become instead the one thing that had finally given Silas Thorne a reason not to break. The coffee had gone cold on the stove by the time Silas came back inside, and that told Lydia more than anything he might have said, because Silas Thorne did not forget about coffee. Not ever. In 4 months of living in the same house with the man, she had never once seen him leave a cup unfinished or let the pot go to waste, and she had come to understand this as one of the small, stubborn ways he held on to ordinary life. The cup, the stove, the ritual of something warm and reliable in a world that had given him very little that was either. He came through the door and looked at the pot and didn't move toward it, and she knew then that whatever had happened at Cole's south boundary had not gone the way he'd intended. Sit down, she said. He sat. That alone told her something. She poured the coffee anyway, reheated it on the stove until it was close enough, and set it in front of him and sat across the table and waited. She'd learned that with Silas, waiting was not passive. It was something you had to do with your whole body, settled and present and not pushing, because the moment he felt pushed, he went somewhere unreachable, not angry, just sealed, like a room with the door shut and no handle on the outside. He was there, Silas said finally. Cole himself. Cole himself. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He didn't come out. Sent Marsh to the fence line. Marsh told me that the cattle would be returned when I was ready to discuss the terms of a land transfer. He wants your land. He's always wanted this land. The creek runs through it. The ridge to the north breaks the worst of the winter wind. My south pasture is the only flat grazing land in a 12-mile stretch. He looked at the table. He's been after it since I filed the deed. What's changed is his method. He used to push quietly, she said. Missing cattle, cut fences, things you couldn't prove. Things I couldn't take to a judge without looking like a man with a grudge and no evidence. His jaw tightened. He's calculated this for a long time. He knows what the law can and can't do out here. But this, driving 30 head off in the night, that's different. That's something a judge could act on. If I had a witness, the word landed between them. Did any of the neighboring ranchers? Nobody saw anything. He said it without bitterness, which almost made it worse. Just flat fact. They don't want to be seen seeing anything. Cole is their neighbor too, and he's got more money and more men and a longer memory than most people want to tangle with. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did you say to Marsh?" Silas looked up at her. Something moved behind his eyes. "I told him to tell Cole that if he sent men onto my land again, I would consider it a personal trespass, and I would respond accordingly." "And Marsh?" Smiled. His voice was even, but she heard what was underneath it. The way men smile when they think they're already holding all the cards. She thought about Marsh's smile in front of the general store. Pale eyes and no warmth. The particular smile of a man who has been given permission to be cruel and is enjoying the feeling of it. "He thinks you'll lose your temper," she said. "That's what Cole is counting on. He provokes you until you do something that can't be defended legally, and then he has what he needs." Silas looked at her. "I know." "Do you?" "Because the way you came through that door." "I know," he said again, and this time there was an edge in it, just a thin one, and she held his gaze until the edge softened. He looked away first. Drank some coffee. Then, "I'm not going to do something stupid." "I didn't say stupid. I said something that can't be defended." "Same thing." "Not always." She folded her hands on the table. "There's a difference between a man who loses his temper and a man who makes a deliberate choice that looks like losing his temper from the outside. One of them is dangerous. The other one is just human." He studied her. She had the feeling, not for the first time, that she said things he didn't expect and that this surprised him less than it used to. "Are you telling me it's all right to hit Marsh?" "I'm telling you," she said carefully, "that I understand why you want to, and that I don't think wanting to makes you the man Cole wants everyone to think you are." She paused. "And I'm telling you that whatever you decide to do about this, I'd prefer to know about it before you do it." The silence that followed was the kind that meant he was actually thinking about what she'd said, rather than just waiting for her to finish. She'd learned to tell the difference. "All right," he said. "All right, you'll tell me, or all right, you've heard me." "Both." She nodded. Let it rest there. "How many did you actually lose?" 32 head. I counted twice. "And the fence?" "Repairable. I'll do it tomorrow." He finished the coffee. Set the cup down in the center of the table, she noticed, not his side. He'd been doing that more often. She still noticed every time. "There's something else." She waited. "Marsh said something before I rode away. About you." He kept his eyes on the cup. "He said Cole hoped you were settling in well. Said Cole looked forward to meeting you properly once things were resolved." The word resolved done in Marsh's voice, she could imagine exactly how it had sounded. "He's trying to make you afraid for me," she said. "He's doing a reasonable job of it." "Silas." She said his name and he looked up. "I was afraid before I came here. I was afraid in that factory every day for 4 years. Afraid of the machines, afraid of the foreman, afraid of what happened to women who said no to the wrong person in a place where nobody was watching. I know what it feels like to live inside fear." She held his gaze. This is not the same. This is different because I'm not alone in it, and because I can see the threat, and because there are things we can actually do." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are the most—" He stopped. "Go ahead," she said. "The most unnervingly calm person I have ever met in a situation that should terrify you." She almost smiled. "I'm not calm. I'm just good at not showing it." Something happened to his face then. It didn't fully become a smile. His face had almost forgotten how to do that, she thought, or perhaps it had never learned the comfortable version of it. But it came closer than it usually did, and in the firelight it changed him, made him look younger and less like a man built entirely from what had been done to him, and she felt something in her chest pull tight and warm, and she made herself look at the table instead of at him, because she wasn't ready to examine that feeling closely yet. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll take first watch tonight." "You're expecting—" "No, but I'm not expecting." He stood, picked up both cups, carried them to the counter. "I've lived long enough to know that when men like Cole move, they don't do it once and wait." She went to bed. She did not sleep well. The first snow came 2 weeks later, earlier than usual and heavier, and it came while Lydia was alone on the property. Silas had ridden to the county seat, 3 hours east, to speak with the land office about documentation. Lydia had suggested it, carefully, after a long conversation about what could and couldn't be proven, about the fact that the deed to the property was the one thing Cole couldn't touch as long as it was correctly filed and witnessed, about the value of having a paper record that existed somewhere other than in the ranch house that Cole's men might visit in the night. Silas had resisted the idea for 2 days, not because it was wrong, but because it meant leaving her alone, and she'd argued him out of that resistance with the particular patience she was developing specifically for arguing him out of things that were fear-based rather than practical. "I can manage the ranch for 1 day," she said. "It's not the ranch I know what it's not." She looked at him steadily. "Silas, if Cole wanted to come at me directly, he'd have done it already. What he wants is for you to feel like he could. There's a difference." He'd ridden out at dawn with a look on his face that she'd categorized privately as controlled worry, which was how he handled most emotions that he didn't want her to see. The snow started around mid-morning. She wasn't alarmed by the snow. She brought in extra wood, made sure the animals were secure, checked the fences she could reach without riding out too far, and was back inside with a fire built up and soup starting before noon. Wyoming weather, she'd learned, was not something you negotiated with. You prepared for it, and then you adjusted, and then you kept going. She was at the kitchen window watching the snow come down in heavy white curtains when she saw the horse. One horse. Coming from the east, from the direction of Cole's land. Moving at a walk, which was wrong. A horse in this weather, with a rider, should be moving faster, should be looking for shelter, not ambling across the open pasture like it had all the time in the world. She watched it for a full minute before she moved. She went to the corner near the door where Silas kept the rifle. A Winchester, which she'd asked him to teach her to use in the first week, and he had, with the thorough practicality he applied to everything. And she checked it and brought it to the window and looked out again. The horse had stopped at the fence line. The rider sat on it without moving. Just stopped there in the snow, watching the house. Her heart was doing something significant in her chest. She kept her breathing even. After perhaps 3 minutes, the rider turned the horse and rode back the direction it had come. She stood at the window with the rifle in her hands until the horse disappeared into the white and then stood there a while longer. When Silas came back that evening, cold and taut from the ride, she told him what she'd seen before he'd even gotten his coat off. She told it flat and complete, no editorializing. He stood in the doorway listening. The snow was still on his shoulders. "One rider, east fence." "Yes." "Did he come to the fence or stay back?" "Came to it, stopped, watched the house for about 3 minutes, then left." He looked at her. She could see him doing the calculation. What it meant, what it was for, whether she was frightened, whether she should be. "You're all right," he said. Not quite a question. "I had the rifle," she said. He nodded, slowly. Came inside and closed the door, and she noticed that he locked it, which he didn't usually do until late at night. And then he went to the window she'd been watching from and looked out at the dark and the snow, and she watched him stand there doing his own version of what she'd done, thinking through what it meant and what could be done about it, and how afraid he should let himself be. She set a plate on the table. "Eat first," she said. You can worry better when you're not cold. He turned from the window, looked at her with an expression that was, she didn't have a word for it exactly, something between exasperation and gratitude, and something else that lived underneath both of those, something warmer than either. You're going to be the end of me, he said, and his voice was low and rough and not unkind. Probably, she agreed. Sit down. He sat down. It was Clara who told her what she'd been putting together herself but hadn't wanted to say aloud, because saying it aloud made it real in a way that was hard to come back from. She'd ridden into Iron Hollow on a clear morning in late October, first clear day in a week, and Clara had pulled her into the back of the dry goods store with an expression that Lydia had come to recognize, that particular tightness around the eyes that meant someone was carrying news they didn't want to carry. There's talk, Clara said, low. Cole's been in the saloon 3 nights running, buying rounds, talking loud about squatters and stolen water rights and men who think they own things they oughtn't. He's building something, Lydia said. He's building support. Clara kept her voice down. Or the appearance of it. Enough men who owe him favors, enough whiskey and enough glasses. It starts to look like a consensus. A consensus for what? Clara looked at her. The kind of consensus that makes it easier to do something that needs covering afterward. Lydia stood very still. The store smelled like dried beans and sawdust and the coal oil from the lamp in the corner, and outside she could hear the ordinary sounds of the settlement going about its day. A horse somewhere, 2 men talking, the distant rhythmic knock of someone chopping wood, and all of it felt suddenly very thin, like scenery painted on paper, like the ordinary world was a layer over something much less ordinary that was getting closer. How many men does Cole have? She asked. 6 on his payroll regular. Could be more if he's hiring. Clara paused. Marsh is the one to watch. He's the one with the personal. She stopped, chose her word. Investment. In what? In seeing Silas brought down. It's not just Cole's agenda with Marsh, it's his own. She looked at her hands for a moment. Silas shot Marsh's brother 5 years ago. Self-defense. The brother drew first in a dispute over cards, and nobody who was there disputed that, but Marsh wasn't in the room, and he's had his version of it ever since. Lydia thought of Marsh's smile, pale and thin and patient, the smile of a man who has been waiting. Does Silas know? That Marsh has a personal reason? Yes. That it's gotten to the point where Marsh might be willing to act outside Cole's interests? Clara shook her head. I don't think he knows how far that particular fire's been burning. She rode back to the ranch with that information sitting in her chest like a coal, hot and heavy, and she thought about how to tell Silas. Not whether she'd long since settled that she didn't keep things from him, that the only thing between them that was worth anything was the understanding that they didn't protect each other from information. But how? How to give him something that was going to make that look come back to his eyes, the one she'd seen the first time she'd mentioned Cole, that particular grim focused thing that was protective and dangerous in equal measure. She told him after supper, same as always, plainly, completely, without softening. He listened without speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Marsh, he said finally, I should have... He stopped. What? Dealt with that sooner. He said it without any particular heat, more like a man acknowledging an error in a plan. I knew about the brother. I didn't know he'd been nursing it this long or at this temperature. It changes the situation. Yes. He leaned back in his chair. Cole is calculating. If Cole decides the risk isn't worth it, he'll pull back, find another angle. Marsh won't. Marsh wants something specific, and Cole's agenda is just a means to it. So even if Cole backs down, Marsh doesn't go away. He nodded, looked at the fire. I need to think about this. While you're thinking, she said carefully, I want to talk about something else. He looked at her. She'd decided on the ride home how to say it. She'd decided to say it the same way she'd said everything to him, directly, without dressing it up. She was 3 weeks late. She'd been trying to account for it with other explanations, the hard work, the disrupted sleep, the change in her diet from what she'd eaten in the East. But 3 weeks was 3 weeks, and she was not a woman who had ever been irregular, and she was not going to pretend she didn't know what 3 weeks meant. I think I'm pregnant, she said. The silence was different from any other silence she'd heard from him. He looked at her, and the thing that moved across his face was so large and so undefended that she was almost startled by it. Startled because in 4 months she'd seen him careful and controlled and occasionally something adjacent to warm, but she had not seen him blindsided, had not seen something hit him so completely that the walls simply weren't fast enough to come up. "You think," he said. His voice was different too, lower. Something careful in it that wasn't caution, but felt like someone handling something irreplaceable. "I'm fairly certain," she said. I'm not wrong about this kind of thing." He didn't say anything for a long moment. She watched him sit with it, watched the thing move through him, all the things it meant. One more person to protect, one more person at risk, one more reason for everything that was coming to be both more dangerous and more necessary, all of it tangled up together with something else, something she could see was real, and that she thought he probably wasn't going to be able to name out loud. "Are you all right?" he asked, finally. "Yes, I'm fine. I'm fine." "You should, Clara would know who, there's a doctor in Ridgeline. It's farther than the county seat, but Silas." She said his name the way she'd learned to say it when he was spinning outward. He stopped, looked at her. "I'm not fragile," she said. "I'm not going to fall apart. A baby doesn't change what I'm capable of. It changes what I'm responsible for," he said. And the way he said it, the raw, stripped-down weight of it, made her throat tighten in a way she didn't expect. "We," she said. He looked at her. "What you're responsible for," she said. "We." Something happened to his face. That opening again, that window with the hand on the latch. But this time it didn't close right away. This time it stayed just for a moment, open. "We," he said, like he was trying the word out, like he wasn't sure it would hold his weight. "We," she confirmed. He looked at her for a long time. Then he got up from the table and did something he had never done before. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, just a moment, warm and deliberate, and then he went to the window and stood there looking out at the dark. She let him have the window, let him stand there with what she'd just given him. Outside, the stars were enormous, and the land was quiet, and the winter was building in the north, slow and certain. Chab, the last week of October brought 3 things in quick succession: a letter, a fire, and the clearest indication yet that what was coming would not wait for spring. The letter came first. It arrived addressed to Silas from a man named Aldous Webb, who turned out to be a lawyer in the county seat, and who wrote to inform Silas that a claim had been filed contesting the northeast boundary of his property, specifically the quarter-mile of creek bank that ran through the north pasture, the same creek that gave the land its water rights. The claim cited a surveying error in the original deed. The claim was signed by Garrett Cole. Silas read the letter twice, handed it to Lydia. She read it once. "This is what he was setting up," she said. "The land office visit. He knew you'd been there. He has someone in the office." Silas said it without surprise. This was the thing she'd come to understand about him. He was rarely surprised by the depths people were willing to go to, only by the direction. Or he's had someone watching. "Can you fight it?" "The deed is correctly filed. The survey is legitimate. But a legal challenge takes time and money and—" He stopped. "He doesn't need to win. He just needs the fight to cost enough that it looks like the easier choice is to sell and go." "Is it? The easier choice?" He looked at her with something like disbelief. "No. Then we file a response and we find a lawyer of our own, and we don't let the cost of the fight become the reason we lose it." She set the letter on the table. "I can write letters. I can manage correspondence. I spent 2 years keeping records for a mill foreman who couldn't read above a 3rd grade level. Legal language isn't so different. It's just someone else trying to confuse you about what's actually being said." He stared at her. "You can read legal documents. I can figure them out. Give me a few hours and I'll tell you what that letter actually means versus what it says it means." He put the letter in front of her and went to do evening chores, and she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and worked through every line of it. And when he came back, she had 2 pages of notes in her own handwriting and a clear summary of what Cole's lawyer was actually claiming and what the 3 weakest points in the claim were. And she watched his face as he read her notes and watched the expression on it shift from taut to something more like the focused readiness of a man who can see the fight clearly and knows he can win it. "Where did you learn to do this?" he said. "I learned to read early, and I never stopped," she said. And I've had enough people try to cheat me out of things to know what the attempt looks like in writing. He looked at her notes, looked at her. We need to get these to a lawyer. I know someone, she said, in the county seat. I wrote to him last week. He went very still. Last week. I thought it was coming, she said simply. I was right. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then he said quietly, You thought of it before I did. I thought of it at the same time. She chose her words. I thought you had enough to carry. He didn't respond to that directly. She didn't expect him to. But that night she heard him in the loft for a shorter time than usual before he went still, and she thought he might have actually slept. The fire was in the barn. She smelled it first, in the deep middle of the night, and was up and at Silas's ladder before she'd fully processed what she was smelling, just her body moving on instinct while her mind caught up, and she called up, Silas, fire, and heard him move before she'd finished the second word. They got the horses out, both of them. Senator and his black gelding, Cain, names that told you something about the man who'd named them. They got the horses out and got them to the far paddock. And by then the back wall of the barn was genuinely burning, orange and loud, and there was nothing to be done for the barn itself. They stood in the cold and watched it burn. She had her coat over her nightgown and her feet in boots she hadn't laced, and the cold was ferocious. But she barely felt it, just stood there next to Silas watching the barn go and thinking, with a cold clarity that surprised even herself. This was deliberate. This was the next step. I didn't hear horses, Silas said. He was very still beside her. The orange light moved on his face and made him look like something carved. Neither did I. She thought about it. They could have come on foot from the east boundary. It's only half a mile across the pasture. Yes. He watched the barn. They know the property. They've been watching it. She remembered the rider in the snow. One horse, east fence, watching. They've been watching us. He said nothing. Silas. She turned to look at him, and the angle of light caught his eyes. And what was in them was something she hadn't seen there before and recognized immediately because she'd seen its cousin in the factory, in the foreman's eyes on the worst days. The precise, directed, fully committed intention of someone who has passed the last threshold before action. I know what you're thinking, she said. Do you? You're thinking about writing E. Tonight. I'm thinking a lot of things. The baby, she said. He turned and looked at her. The barn crackled. Somewhere in the distance, one of the horses made a sound. That's why you can't do something that gets you killed. Her voice was steady. She made it steady. Cole wants you to ride east tonight. He wants you to show up on his land in the dark with a gun and a grievance and no witnesses and no legal standing. He wants you to become the thing everyone already thinks you are. His jaw was tight enough to cut glass. He burned my barn, Lydia. I know. He could have burned the house with you in it. I know. She held his eyes. I know what he's capable of. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing about when and how, not whether. She stepped closer to him, close enough that she had to look up to hold his gaze. We do this right. We do it in a way that he can't come back from. Not in the dark, not tonight, not angry. The fire settled with a long hiss as a section of roof gave way. He looked at her for a very long time in the orange light, the longest he'd ever held her eyes, and she could see everything happening in him, the anger and the fear and the protectiveness and the long disciplined habit of control fighting with something rawer and more desperate underneath all of it, something that had been building since the day she told him about the pregnancy and hadn't finished building yet. I should have ended this before you got here, he said. His voice was rough. I should have finished it with Cole 2 years ago instead of choosing not to be the man everyone already expected you to be. She didn't flinch from it. That wasn't a mistake, Silas. That was you trying to be something better than the stories. Don't let him take that from you tonight. He looked at her. The fire was lower now, eating itself down toward ash. I'm so tired, he said, and it was the most undefended thing she'd ever heard him say. And she understood immediately that he didn't mean tired from the night. He meant the other thing, the long thing, the kind of tired that comes from holding yourself together over years and years and not letting anything through because letting things through hurts too much. She reached out and put her hand against his arm. Not reaching around him, nothing dramatic, just her hand on his arm. Contact, warmth. I am here and I am not going anywhere. He looked down at her hand. Then he covered it with his own, briefly, and then stepped away and looked at the dying barn. We need to build a shelter for the horses before morning, he said. I know. She looked at the barn too. Tell me what we need. They worked through the rest of the night by lantern light, side by side in the cold, and neither of them talked about what had been said in the firelight, but it was there in the space between them, settled and real. And when the pale edge of dawn finally started to show itself in the east, they had something that would keep the horses out of the wind, and they were both still standing. She looked at him across the rough frame of the shelter, both of them raw-eyed from smoke and sleeplessness, and he looked back at her and she thought, whatever happens next, we are not two strangers anymore. They hadn't been for a long time. 2 nights later, they came. She didn't know exactly what woke her. Not a sound, or not one sound she could name, but something had shifted in the quality of the silence outside, something that her body registered before her mind did, the specific wrongness of a quiet that has something hiding inside it. She was at Silas's ladder before she was fully awake. Someone's outside, she said. He was already moving. She didn't ask how he knew. She went for the rifle, and he went for his Colt, and they moved through the dark house without speaking, without lights, in the particular wordless coordination of 2 people who have been sharing a space long enough to know where the other one is without looking. And she thought, even then, even in that moment, that she had never in her life moved like this with another person, this sure-footed, silent understanding. He went to the front window. She took the side. She looked out at the yard and saw nothing, and then looked harder and saw the shape that wasn't a post or a shadow or anything that belonged there. A man standing still at the edge of the yard, watching the house. And then another shape, moving along the fence toward the paddock where the horses were. And then a third, at the corner of the house. 3 visible, she said, voice just above nothing. More behind, he said. Not a guess. He'd done this before in circumstances she still didn't know all of. At least 2 at the back. He looked at her across the dark room. She could see his face just barely, the set of it. I need you away from the windows. I'm not asking you to hide, he said. I'm asking you to be somewhere they can't see you through glass. He moved toward her, fast and quiet, and put his hand briefly on the side of her face. 1 second, warm, certain. Stay low. Cover the back door. He held her eyes. You know what to do. Yes, she said. He nodded. Moved to the front door. She moved to the back of the house, crouching below the window level, the rifle in both hands, her back against the wall beside the back door, and she breathed, slow and deliberate, and she thought about the factory floor and the foreman and the $4 and the letter and Senator, the opinionated horse, and the barn burning against the dark sky and the rough shelter built through the night and the hand on the side of her face just now, warm and certain. She thought about the child that was still only a weight she couldn't feel yet, but that was there, real, hers, theirs. She thought about what Silas had said. What I can offer is safety, a roof, enough food, and my word that no one will ever put their hands on you in my house. She gripped the rifle, and she waited. Outside, something moved, and then the night stopped being quiet at all. The first shot came from outside, not in, which meant Silas had moved faster than they'd anticipated. Lydia heard the crack of it through the back wall of the house. Sharp, close, then a shout that cut off too quickly. And she pressed herself flatter against the wall beside the back door and forced herself to breathe through it, in and out, counting, the way she'd learned to count through the noise of the looms when the sound got so large it stopped being sound and became something physical pressing against the inside of her skull. The back door handle moved. She raised the rifle. It moved again, testing, someone on the other side not yet sure if it was locked, and she watched it with the particular focused stillness of a person who has run out of room for fear and replaced it with something simpler and colder, and she thought, if that door opens, I will not hesitate. She wasn't certain, 3 months ago, that she could have thought that and meant it. She was certain now. The handle stopped moving. Footsteps outside, retreating, and then another shot from the front of the house, and then Silas's voice. Not a shout, not panic, just his voice pitched to carry, "Back door!" She understood. Someone was circling. She moved to the back window, staying below the sill, and raised herself just enough to look out. And there he was, one of them, moving along the outside of the house toward the corner, trying to come around to the front from her side. And she recognized the shape and the movement and the deliberate patience of someone who knew what he was doing. She opened the back door. Not wide, 6 inches. She put the rifle barrel through the gap and said, "Stop where you are." The man froze. "On the ground," she said. "Now, face down, arms out." He was calculating. She could see it even in the dark, the particular stillness of someone weighing options. She moved the rifle barrel fractionally, enough that he'd hear the adjustment. "I'm not asking twice," she said, "and I'm not going to miss." He went down. She kept the rifle on him and called, "Silas." One down at the back, prone, and heard from the front of the house the sound of a scuffle and then a heavy impact and then silence. And the silence was the worst 2 seconds of her life before he answered. "Front clear, 2 down." She exhaled. "Stay there," he said. "Don't come out yet." She didn't argue with the yet. She kept the rifle on the man on the ground and listened to the night and counted her own heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the man on the ground had his face pressed into the dirt and his arms spread, and he was not moving, smart enough to understand that the woman holding the rifle behind him had already made her decision and was simply waiting for him to give her a reason. 60 seconds. 90. Then Silas came around the corner of the house, moving fast and low, and she saw immediately that he was favoring his left side. Not badly, not the way a man moves when he's hurt seriously, but enough. And he looked at the man on the ground and then at her and nodded. "Anyone else?" she asked. 2 more ran. He said it without satisfaction. "I let them." "Why?" "Because Cole needs to know what happened here tonight." He reached down and pulled the man on the ground up by his collar. The man came up compliant, not struggling, the specific compliance of someone who has assessed his situation and is choosing survival. And he needs to hear it from someone who was here. The man on the ground was young. That was the first thing Lydia registered when she could see his face. Younger than she'd expected, mid-20s, not Cole's age or Marsh's, just a young man who'd made a calculation about whose money was worth taking. He had a cut above his eyebrow that was bleeding freely, and he was trying not to show that his hands were shaking. "Where's Marsh?" Silas said. The young man pressed his lips together. Silas looked at him. Not with anger, something worse than anger, something that was simply the complete absence of uncertainty. "I'm going to ask you once more," he said, "and then I'm going to make a choice about what happens next that you are not going to enjoy. Where is Dylan Marsh?" "He didn't come," the young man said. Fast, like the words had been sitting against the back of his teeth. Cole told him to stay back, said it was simpler this way. Silas was quiet for a moment. Simpler. Said if something went wrong, Marsh couldn't be placed here. Silas looked at Lydia. She looked back at him. They both understood what that meant, and the understanding passed between them without words. The particular shorthand of 2 people who have been thinking through the same problem from the same angle for long enough that they don't need to say all the steps out loud. Cole had kept Marsh away because Marsh was the dangerous variable, the one with a personal reason, the one who might, if put in a room with Silas Thorne on a dark night, stop being a tool and start being something that couldn't be managed, which meant Cole was smarter about Marsh than Marsh was about himself, which meant Cole was the priority. "What's your name?" Lydia asked the young man. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, surprise maybe that she was the one asking. "Pete Halvers." "Pete." She kept her voice even. "How much did Cole pay you?" He said a number. It was not a large number. She looked at him for a moment, this young man with his bleeding forehead and his shaking hands and his dollar amount that wasn't worth what tonight had cost him. "Was it enough?" she asked. He looked at the ground. "No," he said. They tied Pete Halvers to the porch post for the remainder of the night. Not cruelly, not without a blanket, but secured, because leaving him unsecured was a risk that Silas wasn't willing to take, and Lydia didn't argue with. And Silas went around the property in the dark, checking what damage had been done and what hadn't, and Lydia went inside and built the fire back up and sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and her notes and tried to think. Silas came in after 20 minutes. He moved to the kitchen counter, and she saw him reach past the coffee and pour 2 fingers of the whiskey he kept in the back cabinet, the one he almost never touched. He drank it standing, looking at nothing, and then set the glass down and turned to face her. He was aiming for the cattle again, he said. The two who ran, they were headed for the paddock. Probably meant to scatter the horses, too. He paused. If you hadn't been at the back door, Pete Halvers would have come through it and gotten as far as the bedroom. She heard what was under the sentence. But I was at the back door. But you were. He looked at her. The lamplight was unsteady and it made his face harder to read, though she'd been learning to read it for months now. Are you all right? Yes? She considered adding something to that and decided the yes was complete on its own. The baby is fine, she said. I'm fine. I didn't fall. I didn't get hit. I'm fine. She watched him. You're favoring your left side. I caught a fist. It's not. Show me. He started to refuse. She could see it, the automatic pulling back that he did with anything that suggested he needed tending to. And then he stopped himself and pulled up the left side of his shirt, and she looked at the bruise already forming along his rib cage, purple going black in the lamplight, and pressed her fingers along it carefully and felt him hold the breath against it. Cracked, she said. Maybe, or just badly bruised. Either way, you need to tape it. She stood. Sit down. It's not that. Silas, sit down and let me help you. He sat down. It was getting easier, she thought, this conceding to being cared for. It still cost him something every time, but the cost was getting smaller. She got the linen from the chest and came back and worked carefully, and he sat very still for it, looking at the table, not talking, which was his way of not making it more than it was. And she appreciated that because she didn't want it to be more than it was either, didn't want it to turn into a scene, just wanted to do the thing that needed doing. She asked as she worked. The ones at the front. One's unconscious, one's got a broken wrist from when I took his gun. They're both tied at the front of the house. We have 3 prisoners. We have 3 prisoners, he confirmed, and 2 who ran back to Cole to report. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. In the morning, I'm riding to the county seat. She stopped, looked at him. Not to do anything foolish, he said, and she could hear the slight dryness in it, the smallest fraction of humor that he'd been allowing through more lately. To get the sheriff. She finished the tape and smoothed it flat. The sheriff who's never managed to find evidence against Cole in 15 years. Cole made a mistake tonight. He said it with a certainty that wasn't bravado, just calculation. He sent men onto my property. They're still on my property, 2 of them tied to my porch. Pete Halvers will talk. He's already talking. He gave us the connection to Cole the moment he confirmed who sent him. He turned to look at her. With your legal notes from the land claim, and 3 witnesses to an assault on a private residence, and the barn burning we can tie to Cole's men. This is different from missing cattle and cut fence lines. She thought it through. It's still a long road. Yes, but it's a road that goes somewhere. He held her eyes. What I said before, that I wanted to ride east that night the barn burned. You were right that I couldn't do it then, but you were also right that it's not about whether. It's about when and how. He paused. This is the when and how. She nodded slowly. There's something else, he said. He hesitated, which he rarely did, and the hesitation meant it was something he hadn't decided how to say yet. Marsh, Cole keeping him away tonight. I need to get in front of that. If Cole goes down and Marsh isn't part of it, if Marsh is clean while Cole is finished, Marsh has more freedom to act on his own, not less. She understood. She'd been thinking the same thing since the young man had said it. Cole told him to stay back. You need Marsh connected to Cole's actions legally before Cole goes down. Or I need to deal with Marsh separately, directly. What does directly mean? He met her eyes. I don't know yet. Something short of what he deserves and longer than what I want to offer. That's not an answer. It's the most honest answer I have right now. She accepted that. It was, she'd come to understand, how Silas worked through things. Not fast, not with false certainty, but genuinely, one step at a time, and never pretending to know more than he did. It had irritated her in the beginning, this refusal to give her clean answers. Now she thought it was one of the most trustworthy things about him. Get some sleep, she said. A few hours. I'll watch Pete. You're not going to... I'll watch Pete from inside the window, with the rifle. She looked at him steadily. You can't ride to the county seat in the morning if you've been up all night. He looked at her for a long moment. When did you get so good at this? He said. At what? At managing me. She picked up the lamp. I'm not managing you. I'm making sure the man I'm married to can function tomorrow. She paused. There's a difference. She heard him, some time later, finally settle in the loft, and she sat at the dark window with the rifle across her knees and watched Pete Halvers sleep, tied to the porch post with Cole's blanket around him. And she thought about all the decisions that had brought her to this particular chair at this particular window, and she thought that not one of them had been a mistake, not even the ones that had been frightening, not even the one that had seemed the most frightening of all. The sheriff's name was Dale Cutter, and he was a tall, sandy-haired man in his 50s who wore his badge like a man who'd had it long enough to stop thinking about it, and who listened to Silas with the particular focused silence of someone who has heard a great many things and learned to wait until the end before deciding what he thinks about them. Lydia sat across the desk from him in the county seat sheriff's office and laid out her notes while Silas talked, and she watched Cutter's face as he went through them, and she saw the moment, the precise moment, when something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a door opening onto something he'd suspected was on the other side for a long time. The land claim, Cutter said, tapping her notes. You can document Cole's lawyer filed this the same week your husband visited the land office? My husband visited a Wednesday, Lydia said. The claim was filed the following Monday. I have the date from the office notification and the date of our visit documented in the land records office log, which I requested a copy of. She slid the copy across his desk. Cutter looked at it. He had a long face and a habit of pressing his thumb against his lower lip when he was thinking, and he did it now, sitting back in his chair. You put this together yourself. We put it together, she said, and meant it. He looked at Silas. Your wife, he said, not unkindly. My wife, Silas confirmed. Pete Halvers is still at your place? With the other two, yes. Cutter was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the county seat went about its ordinary business. A wagon, voices, the sound of the livery 2 doors down. Garrett Cole has been in this county for 20 years, Cutter said. He's been careful for 20 years. What changed? He thought he had something to use, Silas said. His voice was even. He was wrong about what it was. Cutter looked between them. You came here together. We came here together, Lydia said. The sheriff picked up her notes again, went through them a second time more slowly. I'm going to need to ride out to your place today and take statements from Halvers and the others before I can do anything official. He set the notes down. And I'm going to need more than what's here before I can go near Cole directly. What more do you need? Silas asked. Someone willing to testify in front of a judge that Cole gave the order. He looked at Silas. Halvers might. The other two, depending on what they're facing. He folded his hands. And I need you to keep those 3 on your property and not do anything to them that would make their testimony inadmissible or that would give Cole's lawyer room to make you the story instead of Cole. Understood, Silas said. And I need... Cutter stopped. Something moved behind his eyes. I need you to stay away from Dylan Marsh. Silas looked at him. You know about Marsh. I know about Marsh the way I know about everything in this county that I can't prove. He held Silas's gaze. Marsh is the piece of this that worries me most. Not Cole. Cole I can handle if you give me the evidence. Marsh is... He shook his head slightly. Leave Marsh to me. It was the wrong thing to say, and Lydia saw on Silas's face the moment he heard it as the wrong thing. Saw the slight tightening that meant something inside him was not going to agree with this instruction and was only deciding how to say so. She put her hand on his arm, under the table. He looked at her. She said nothing, just looked at him. The particular look that said, not here, not now, let it be. He looked back at Cutter. I'll do what I can, he said, which was not quite a promise. Cutter heard that. But he let it stand because a man like Dale Cutter, after 20 years with a badge, knows the difference between the promises he can get and the ones he can't, and he knew which category he was dealing with. The ride back from the county seat was quiet for the first hour, the two of them moving at an easy pace through the cold afternoon, with the kind of silence between them that had its own texture by now, nothing like the silence of that first wagon ride months ago, which had been the silence of 2 strangers carefully not taking up too much space. This was different. This was the silence of people who know each other's weight and have made room for it. It was Lydia who broke it. "Tell me about the first time you met Cole," she said. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I've been thinking about Cutter's face when he talked about Marsh. He's not afraid of Cole, but he's careful about him. That's different from being afraid." She watched the road ahead. "And I want to understand what we're actually dealing with, not what Cole has done recently, where it started." He was quiet for a moment. Senator moved steadily beneath her, the gray mare's breath making small clouds in the cold air. Beside her, Silas rode Cain with the loose-reined ease of a man who spent more time on horseback than off it. "Cole's father owned the land east of the creek when I got here," he said finally. "Old man died about a year after I filed my deed, left everything to Garrett." He looked at the road. "Garrett came to see me within a week of the old man's funeral. Very civil. Very polite. Said he wanted to discuss buying my property at a fair price. Said the creek was a family matter, that his father had always intended to own the full water rights, that it was sentimental." "What did you say?" "I said the land wasn't for sale." "And?" He nodded, said he understood, said he hoped we could be good neighbors. The smallest pause. 3 months later, 7 of my cattle were missing. 2 months after that, one of my hired hands quit without telling me why. I found out later Cole had offered him double wages to manage one of his south properties. He kept his eyes forward. "It went like that for a year. Small things. Things that could be coincidence. But weren't. But weren't." He glanced at her. "The first time it stopped being small was about 2 years in. I had a hand named Reeves, good man, had been with me from the beginning. Cole's men beat him badly enough that he couldn't work for 6 weeks. Reeves wouldn't say it was Cole's men. I knew it was." He paused. "That was the first time I thought about riding east and finishing it." "What stopped you?" I was quiet for a moment. "Reeves," he said. "He asked me not to. Said if I went after Cole directly, whatever happened to me next would be on his conscience." He shifted slightly in the saddle. "I didn't want to give someone else something to carry." She looked at him. This man who worried about what other people carried. This man who had spent 15 years being feared and who worried, quietly and privately, about putting things on other people's consciences. "And after Reeves," she said. "After Reeves it went quiet for a while. Then the cattle drives, the fence lines. Then you got here." He looked at her with an expression she was still learning. Something open and careful at the same time, like someone holding a door from both sides simultaneously. And then it accelerated. "Because you finally had something worth taking from you. Because I finally had something worth taking from me." He said it without self-consciousness, which cost him something, she thought, even if she couldn't see exactly what. She let it rest there for a moment between them, in the cold air and the sound of hooves and the open land going gray with afternoon. "Silas," she said. What you said that day. To Clara. That you were tired of being the only one who knew what it costs." She watched him. "I know what it costs now. I've been paying it with you for months." She held his gaze when he turned to look at her. "I want you to know that I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry I came. I'm not sorry about any of it." He looked at her for a long moment, and the afternoon light was the particular low gold of a November afternoon in the territory. And it caught the lines of his face, the scar, the exhaustion that still lived there but was less. Less than it had been when she'd first seen him in Clara's store. She was certain of it, the way you're certain of gradual things only once they've already happened. And he said nothing for a long moment and then said quietly, "Neither am I." 2 words. She felt them land. What? Cutter rode out the following morning with a deputy she hadn't seen before, young and serious, and took statements from Pete Halvers and the other 2, who had names she filed away, Creed, and a man who gave only a last name, Oster, and who were both, by now, unhappy enough about their situation and unimpressed enough with Cole's commitment to their welfare that they talked more freely than Pete had, which was saying something because Pete had talked quite freely. She served coffee and stayed in the kitchen while the interviews happened in the main room, not because she was excluded, but because she thought her presence might complicate the comfort level of men who were not naturally inclined toward honesty and might feel less judged without a woman in the room. She heard enough from the kitchen. What she heard was a confirmation of things she and Silas had already pieced together, and one thing they hadn't. Cole had been in contact with a man in the Territorial Land Office for 3 years. Not just for the recent claims, for 3 years. getting access to deed records, survey notes, filing dates, building a picture of what could be challenged and how. She wrote that down and underlined it twice. When Cutter came into the kitchen for a second cup, he looked at what she was writing and didn't say anything about it for a moment. Then, "You're keeping records." "Everything that could be useful in a legal proceeding," she said. "Dates, names, what was said and by whom, in front of which witnesses." He looked at the page, then at her. "Where'd you learn to do that?" She thought of the mill, of the 2 years keeping inventory records for a foreman who didn't trust that the numbers would work out in his favor unless someone else was watching them. "Necessity," she said. He took the coffee and went back to the main room, and she heard him say something to the deputy in a low voice and couldn't make out the words. But the tone was the tone of a man who has revised an estimate upward. Cutter took the 3 men with him when he left. Pete Halvers looked back at the house once as they rode out, at Lydia standing on the porch, and she couldn't read his expression entirely, something between relief and shame and the specific bewilderment of someone who had come to do harm and had somehow ended up somewhere more complicated than harm. She nodded at him. Not forgiveness, she hadn't decided about that yet, but acknowledgement. "I see you. You made a choice. You're making another one now." He looked away and rode on. Silas came to stand beside her on the porch. They watched the horses until they were small against the distance. "Cutter's moving," she said. "Yes." "Is it enough?" "It's a start." He was quiet for a moment. "The man in the land office. That's the piece that changes things. If Cutter can prove a relationship there, Cole's challenge to the deed falls apart, and he's looking at a corruption charge on top of everything else." "And Marsh?" He didn't answer immediately. She waited. "Cutter said to leave Marsh to him," he said. "I know what Cutter said." "I know you know." He turned and looked at her directly. "I'm not going to do something stupid." "I know that too. That's not what I'm asking." She held his eyes. "I'm asking what you want to do, and whether it's something we need to talk about before you do it." The pause this time was long enough to mean something. "Marsh is going to come here," Silas said. "With or without Cole's sanction, once Cole starts to fall, Marsh is going to come here, because what he wants has never been about the land or the water rights or any of Cole's reasons. What he wants is—" He stopped, looked at the distance. "He wants to finish something, and he won't stop wanting that just because Cole is in legal trouble." "Then we need to be ready for him," she said. "I need to be ready." "We," she said. Same tone as the night she'd first said it, after she'd told him about the baby. Non-negotiable, just true. He looked at her. "You're not going to let me do this one alone, are you?" "No." He almost smiled. That almost smile that lived in the outer corners of his eyes more than it lived on his mouth. "Even if I asked. Even if you asked." She turned toward the door. "Come inside. I need to show you what I've been working on." What she'd been working on was a letter. She'd spent 2 evenings writing it, draft after careful draft, the kind of letter that has to say exactly the right things in exactly the right order and cannot afford a single sentence that could be read 2 ways. It was addressed to the territorial governor's office, and it laid out, in the clearest language she could manage, a pattern of land theft, intimidation, assault, and corruption that stretched across the better part of a decade in this county, backed by dates and names and specific incidents and the legal notes she'd compiled, and it cited the ongoing sheriff's investigation as evidence that the matter was already in official channels and requested that a territorial representative be assigned to oversee the proceedings so that no local relationship, the kind that money and time can buy, could interfere with the outcome. Silas read it at the kitchen table. He read it the way he read things he wanted to understand completely, slowly, going back to sentences, not moving on until something was settled. She sat across from him and drank her tea and waited. When he finished, he set the letter down on the table and looked at it for a moment and then looked at her. "You've been writing this for a while," he said, "since you first told me about the deed challenge." He was quiet. She watched him. "Lydia." He said her name and then stopped, like the name itself had been what he meant to say, and the sentence was just the scaffolding around it. "It needs one thing you have that I don't," she said. "A witness to the things that happened before I arrived. Someone who's been in this county long enough to corroborate the pattern." "Clara," he said. "Clara." She nodded. "I've already spoken to her. She'll do it." She said, Lydia paused, and something in her expression shifted, soft at the edges. She said it's about time someone made a proper record of what this county has been pretending not to see. Silas looked at the letter again. He put his hand flat on the page, the way she'd seen him put his hand flat on things when he was processing them, when the thing was real and he needed the physical certainty of it. His hand was large and scarred, and it rested on her careful handwriting, and she thought, this is what it looks like when two people do something together that neither of them could have done alone. Send it, he said. Tomorrow morning. I'll ride to Clara first, then the post. She paused. With the rifle. With the rifle, he confirmed, and this time the almost smile made it all the way to his mouth, just barely, just a fraction. But she saw it, and she kept it. The night before Lydia rode out, she woke to Silas sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. Not unusual. She'd found him at the window before, at the stove, moving through the house in the black hours with the particular restlessness of a man whose sleep had never fully trusted him. But this was different. He wasn't moving, he was just sitting, still, both hands around an empty cup. She came to the kitchen doorway and looked at him for a moment. Can't sleep? She said. Go back to bed, he said. Not unkindly. She went to the stove and put water on. He didn't tell her to leave again. She took that as permission and sat across from him, and they were quiet while the water heated, in the dark with just the embers from the banked fire giving the room its faint red edge. Tell me, she said. He was quiet for a moment. My brother, he said. I keep thinking about him tonight. She hadn't expected that. She waited. 7 years without speaking, because I stayed in the war too long, because I... He stopped, looked at the empty cup. He was right that I stayed too long. He was right that I came back different. He was right about most of it. He paused. But I didn't know how to say that in a letter. I didn't know how to say anything that wasn't... He shook his head slightly. I was so used to not talking about things, about any of it. By then it had been so long I didn't know where to start. So you didn't start. So I didn't start. He looked up at her. And now he's dead, and I am going to carry that for the rest of my life, and there's nothing to be done about it. She poured the tea when it was ready and set his cup in front of him and sat back down, and she thought very carefully about what to say, because this was the kind of moment where the wrong word was worse than no word, and Silas Thorne had lived alone inside this particular grief for a long time, and what he needed from her right now was not to be told how to feel about it. I know, she said. Just that. He looked at her. I know. No, she said again. Some things stay broken. You told me that. She held his eyes. But you're not the same man who didn't write. You know that. I'm not sure it matters. It matters to the child, she said quietly. That man, the one who wouldn't start a letter, who carried everything alone. He won't be the father. She put her hand on the table, not quite touching his. That's not a small thing. He looked at her hand on the table. Then he put his over it. And this time it wasn't brief, and he didn't pull it back. They sat like that for a while in the near dark, in the quiet house, in the territory that had tried so hard to break him. And outside the wind moved through the cottonwoods with that low, steady sound she'd first found lonely and now found something closer to familiar. And Silas Thorne held her hand in the dark and was not, for once, holding himself together all alone. The writer came at midday, 3 days after the letter went out. Not Marsh. She'd steeled herself for Marsh all morning, in the way you steel yourself for things you've decided you're not going to run from. But the rider who came up the lane and stopped in the yard was not Marsh. It was a young man in a good coat with a horse that hadn't been ridden hard, and he had a sealed envelope that he handed to Silas without ceremony and rode back out before either of them had opened it. Inside was a single page. Territorial Government letterhead. She read it over Silas's shoulder. An Office of Territorial Oversight had been engaged. A representative would arrive within the week. All proceedings related to land claims and criminal investigations in the county were to be suspended pending the representative's review. She looked up from the letter. Silas was already looking at her. It worked, she said. It worked, he said. And then, after a pause, because he was Silas and he didn't let himself have things easily. We don't know yet what the representative will find. We don't know how this ends legally. No, she agreed. But we know Cole can't move until the representative has been and gone. And we know that Cutter has 3 witnesses and our records and the land office documentation. She folded the letter. And we know that for the first time in 15 years, someone with authority has been formally told what's been happening in this county. He looked at the folded letter in her hands, at her face, at the yard behind her, and the land beyond the yard, and the sky above the ridge that was going clear and cold with the promise of more winter. "Lydia," he said. "Yes." "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I wrote that first letter, the matrimonial notice. I wrote it and sent it, and then I spent 2 weeks certain nobody would answer it who wasn't either desperate or deceiving themselves." He paused. "And then your letter came, and it was so blunt, so completely without pretense. You said you weren't beautiful and you weren't delicate and you had no piano lessons and no family money. And I sat with that letter for 3 days before I wrote back because I couldn't figure out what to say to a person that honest." She looked at him. "I wrote back because I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought, here is someone who is not going to pretend this is something it isn't. And I had been pretending things were something they weren't, or pretending they weren't anything at all, for so long that the idea of not doing that—" He shook his head slightly. "I didn't know it would be this." "What did you think it would be?" "Practical. Manageable." He looked at her steadily. "I thought I could keep it. Contained. I thought I knew how to do that." "And?" "And you fixed a chicken coop in a rainstorm and argued me out of riding east and wrote a letter to the territorial governor and told me we in a voice that didn't leave room for argument." Something moved across his face, deep and real and undefended in a way she'd seen from him only a handful of times, each time feeling like a privilege. "I have not been able to keep a single thing contained since you got here." She felt something warm and complicated move through her chest. "Is that a complaint?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said, "it is not." She stepped forward and he met her halfway, and it was not graceful. Nothing about them was graceful. But he put his arms around her and she leaned into him and he held on, genuinely held on, with the full weight of everything he'd been carrying, and she felt the solidness of him, and the warmth, and the slight hitch at the left ribs where the bruise still lived, and she thought, this is what it is. This exact thing, this imperfect, hard-won, complicated, real thing. The wind came off the ridge with the first real bite of deep winter in it, and neither of them moved. Outside, the land was quiet. The cottonwoods bent and straightened. The horses moved in the paddock, Senator and Kane, opinionated and steady, the two of them long since worked out between themselves who occupied which corner. And in the house on the property that ran east to the creek and north to the ridge and west to the cottonwood stand, the feared man who had expected to die alone stood in the yard holding the woman he had not expected, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing left to say that wasn't already being said by the holding itself. The territorial representative arrived on a Thursday, which felt appropriate somehow, because in Lydia's experience, all the things that actually changed the shape of a life arrived on ordinary days without warning or ceremony, just a rider coming up a lane the same as any other rider on any other morning. His name was Edwin Holt. No relation to Clara, though the coincidence of the name made Lydia's mouth twitch when she heard it. And he was a compact, precise man in his late 40s with ink-stained fingers and the particular kind of eyes that read a room before they read the people in it. He came with one assistant, a young man who took notes without being asked, and who Lydia immediately respected. Holt shook Silas's hand and then Lydia's with the same weight, which she also noted, and accepted coffee, and sat at the kitchen table and spread the documents he'd brought with him beside the documents she'd been compiling, and spent the better part of an hour reading in silence while the winter light moved across the floor. Silas stood near the window. He always stood near windows when things were happening that he couldn't control, she'd come to understand. Something about being able to see the outside, the open land, the unchanging sky. It was the same impulse as the toolbox, the stove, the coffee in the morning, the things that stayed the same. She sat at the table across from Holt and answered what he asked, calmly and completely. The land office contact was named Prudhomme. Holt's expression when she gave the name was the expression of a man confirming something he'd already suspected, which told her this wasn't the first county where that name had come up. She wrote that inference down in her own notes after he'd moved on to the next question, because the pattern mattered. If Cole had been using the same contact across multiple counties, It was a much larger thing than one man trying to steal one ranch. "You're documenting my questions," Holt said, not with displeasure, just observation. "I'm documenting everything," she said. He looked at her notes, looked at her. "You're not from the territory." "No." "How long have you been here?" 7 months? He made a sound that might have been appreciation or might just have been thought and went back to his papers. She went back to hers. The meeting lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Holt closed his case and looked at Silas, who had moved from the window to the kitchen doorway somewhere around the second hour, and stood with his arms folded and his face giving nothing away. And the way that Lydia had learned was not coldness, but attention. The expression of a man who is listening so hard, there's no energy left for expression. "Mr. Thorne," Holt said, "I want to be honest with you about where this stands." "Please," Silas said. "What Mrs. Thorne has compiled is the most organized record of incremental land-based harassment I've reviewed in 11 years in this office. The documentation of the Prudhomme connection, in particular, gives us jurisdiction that extends well beyond your property line." He paused. "What it does not do, on its own, is put Garrett Cole in front of a judge. For that I need testimony from people Cole gave direct orders to, preferably in writing." "Pete Halvers," Lydia said, "and the others." "Sheriff Cutter has their statements. I'll be meeting with him tomorrow." Holt folded his hands. "The question of Dylan Marsh is separate, and I want to address it directly." He looked at Silas. "I know about the brother. I know Marsh has been waiting for a situation that would allow him to act with some cover of legitimacy. If Cole goes down formally, and Marsh is not tied to Cole's actions legally, Marsh becomes a free agent," Silas said. Flat. "Yes." Holt met his eyes. "I want your word, Mr. Thorne, that you will not handle Marsh yourself before I've had the opportunity to establish that connection through Cole's people." The silence that followed was the same silence Lydia had heard when Cutter made the same request. The silence of a man who is weighing what a promise costs against what it protects. She did not put her hand on his arm this time. This one, she thought, he needed to decide alone. "How long do you need?" Silas asked. 2 weeks, possibly 3. Silas looked at the table, at the documents spread across it, at everything that Lydia had built, page by careful page, in the margins of their daily life. Then he looked at her briefly, just a glance, just a check, the look that had become their private language for, "Is this right? Am I reading this right?" And she gave him the smallest nod. 2 weeks, he said to Holt. "That's what I can give you." Holt accepted it. He knew, she thought, the same thing Cutter had known, that some promises have edges and some promises don't, and the ones with edges are sometimes the only honest kind you can ask for. Marsh came on the 9th day, not to the ranch. That was what she hadn't anticipated. She'd been watching the east fence line, watching the direction that trouble had always come from, watching the approach from Cole's land, and Marsh came from town instead, which meant he came from the west, from the direction she'd been watching least. She was alone again. Not because she and Silas had stopped being careful about it, but because Clara had sent a message that she'd had a fall and her wrist was badly sprained and she needed help, and Lydia had gone. And Silas had been checking the south fence and hadn't come back yet, and Marsh had evidently been watching for exactly this kind of window, which told her he'd been watching them for longer and more carefully than she'd known. And the thought of that, the patience of it, the cold, deliberate patience, made something tighten in her chest that was not quite fear, but lived right next to it. She saw him before he reached the yard. She was at the window. She was always at the window now. It had become as automatic as breathing. And she saw the horse, and then the rider, and then the shape of the man, and she knew him by his way of moving. That particular unhurried ease that was not ease at all, but the body language of someone who has decided the outcome in advance. She went for the rifle. Then she stopped. She stood in the middle of the kitchen floor with the rifle half raised and thought very clearly and very fast. And what she thought was, if I go to that door with a rifle, this becomes the confrontation Marsh has been building toward. He will have a reason. He will have the story he needs. She thought about what Silas had said. Cole is calculating. Marsh is personal. And she thought about the difference between those two things and what it meant for how Marsh was going to behave if she gave him the wrong opening. She put the rifle down, picked up the rifle again. put it against the wall beside the door within reach but not in her hands. And she opened the door before he could knock. He looked at her. She looked at him. His pale eyes moved past her into the house. Automatic assessment, the same thing she'd learned to do herself over these months, and then came back to her face. "Mrs. Thorne," he said. "Mr. Marsh. Your husband home?" "He'll be back shortly." She didn't move from the doorway. She also didn't fill the doorway the way a smaller person might, trying to physically block entry. She just stood in it, neutral, present, the same way she'd stood her ground with Senator the very first morning, which felt, right now, like the same kind of test and the same necessary response. Marsh looked at her for a moment with that thin patience of his. "Mind if I wait?" "On the porch," she said. Something moved in his eyes. "Cold day for the porch." "I didn't invite you into my home," she said. "You're welcome to wait on the porch. I'll bring coffee if you'd like." He studied her. She looked back at him without blinking, without adjusting, and she thought, he expected to unsettle me. He has been counting on unsettling me. That is the tool, and if I let him use it, he will use it all the way to whatever end he's planned. "You're not afraid of me," he said. Curious, almost, like he was noting a fact about weather. "I'm aware of who you are and what you've done," she said. "That's different from afraid." She paused. "The porch, Mr. Marsh." He stepped back from the door. She closed it, not hard, and went immediately to the window and watched him take a seat on the porch bench that faced the yard and the road, and she went to the back door and opened it and screamed Silas's name as loud as her voice would go across the open land. Then she made coffee because she'd offered it, and she was not going to be a woman who made offers she didn't keep, even to a man she'd rather see arrested, and she watched the porch through the window and watched the road through the other window, and she waited. Silas came across the south field at a pace that told her he'd heard her and understood the tone, and he came through the gate and stopped when he saw the horse at the post, and she saw him register it, and she saw what happened in his body when he did. That stillness, that particular stillness. And then he kept walking toward the porch, and she went to the front door and opened it. The two men looked at each other across the porch. She stood in the doorway with the coffee and said nothing. "Silas," Marsh said. He said the name like an old word. "Dylan." Silas came up the porch steps. He did not sit. He stood with his hands at his sides, open, which she'd learned meant he was being deliberate about not reaching for anything. "Long ride from town." "Heard Cole's got company from the territory," Marsh said. "Heard it's getting complicated for him." "Heard that too." Marsh looked at his hands for a moment. He had a gun on his hip, and so did Silas. And the porch was small, and they were close, and she was standing in the doorway with coffee, and the whole thing had a terrible intimacy to it, the intimacy of something that has been building for years and has finally run out of room. "I'm not here about Cole," Marsh said. "I know," Silas said. "You know why I'm here." "Yes." Lydia set the coffee cups on the porch rail. Neither man touched them. She did not go back inside. Marsh looked at her. You might want to—" "I'm staying," she said. His pale eyes moved back to Silas. Something in him seemed to settle, some final decision made. "Your boy drew first," he said, 5 years ago. "Everyone in that room said so. I'm not arguing the facts." Silas said nothing. "But he was 22 years old." Marsh's voice was still even, still that patient, controlled sound. But underneath it now, she could hear what lived there, the thing that had been burning for 5 years. And it was not what she'd expected, not rage, not the hot, calculating anger of a man planning revenge. It was grief, plain and old and exhausted. He was 22 years old and stupid, and I'd spent 10 years trying to keep him from exactly the kind of room he walked into that night, and I was too late by about 40 minutes. The porch was quiet. "I know," Silas said. His voice was different than it had been 30 seconds ago. Still low, still controlled, but something had gone out of the guard in it, something that recognized the grief for what it was and did not want to be armored against it. "I know how old he was. You didn't have to kill him. He would have killed me." "I know that too." Marsh pressed his lips together, looked at the yard. "I know it, and I have never been able to make myself believe it at the same time. Those two things have been living in me like two dogs that hate each other, and I'm so—" He stopped. The word he didn't say sat there. Tired. It was tired, the same tired she'd heard in Silas that first night. "I'm so tired." Silas sat down, not in the chair, on the porch rail across from Marsh, which put them at the same level, which she understood was deliberate. "I've thought about your brother most years since it happened," he said. I'm not telling you that for absolution. I'm telling you because you should know it." Marsh looked at him. "It doesn't fix anything." "No, it doesn't." Silas looked at his hands. "Nothing fixes it. You know that." The silence went long. She stayed in the doorway and did not move and barely breathed, because what was happening on the porch was something she understood instinctively should not be interrupted, that it was fragile in the specific way that honest things between men who have been circling each other's damage are fragile. "Cole used you," she said finally, quietly. Both men looked at her. "He knew about your brother," she said to Marsh. "He kept you close because of it. He pointed you at Silas like—" She stopped, found a word that was accurate without being cruel. Like a tool he didn't have to sharpen. The grief did that for him. She held Marsh's eyes. "Everything you've done in this county in the last 2 years, the watching, the threatening, driving off the cattle, that wasn't your agenda. That was Cole's. You were just the one carrying the personal reason that made you reliable." Marsh was very still. "He kept you away from the night of the assault," she said. "Did you know that? He specifically held you back, not to protect you, to protect himself. Because if you'd come and something had gone wrong, you'd have been the one who couldn't be controlled. He told his men to keep you away because you were useful to him only as long as you had a reason to act and hadn't acted yet." She watched it land, watched it move through Marsh's face, the recognition of it, the slow and ugly understanding of how he'd been positioned and what it meant about everything he'd done in the service of a grief that Cole had been using for his own purposes all along. "Cole didn't care about your brother," she said. "Your brother was a story Cole told himself about why you'd always come when he called." Marsh's jaw was tight. He looked at the yard. He looked at the coffee cups on the rail that nobody had touched. He looked at Silas. "She always liked this?" he said. Silas looked at her. That almost smile. The real one. The one she'd earned over months of work and argument and rainstorms and midnight kitchens. "Yes," he said. Marsh let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and old. "What do you want from me, Thorne?" "I want you to talk to the territorial representative," Silas said. "Tell him what you know about Cole. Tell him what you were asked to do, and what you did, and what you didn't do. All of it. That implicates me." "Yes, some of it." Silas looked at him directly. "I'll tell Holt that you came here today. I'll tell him what was said. I can't make decisions for his office, but I can make sure he knows what kind of man he's dealing with, the kind who came and talked instead of the other thing." He paused. "That's worth something. I don't know exactly how much, but it's worth something." Marsh looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had killed his brother and was now, in the same breath, offering him the least terrible of his remaining options, and the terrible complexity of that, being offered grace by the wrong person in the wrong situation for the wrong reasons, moved across his face in a way she couldn't look away from. "I'll think about it," Marsh said. He stood, put his hat on, looked at Lydia one more time, and whatever he'd expected when he'd ridden out here today, she was clearly not it, and she thought that was probably all right. He untied his horse and rode back toward town. She and Silas stood on the porch and watched him go. "Do you think he'll do it?" she asked. "I think he might." He was quiet for a moment. "He's tired enough." She picked up the untouched coffee cups and thought about tired and what it does to people. Sometimes it breaks them, and sometimes it breaks open the thing that's been in the way of something better. And the difference between those two outcomes was usually whether someone was standing close enough to matter when the breaking happened. Marsh talked to Holt 4 days later. She found out from Clara, who found out from her husband, who heard it from the deputy, which was how news moved in Iron Hollow, not through announcement, but through the connective tissue of people who paid attention to what was happening and shared it with the people they trusted. By the time the information reached Lydia, it was accurate in substance, if not in every detail, and what it said was that Dylan Marsh had walked into Holt's temporary office in the county seat and spent 3 hours giving a complete account of his involvement with Cole, including 2 incidents she and Silas hadn't known about, and which Holt's assistant had written down with the careful speed of someone who understands they are writing something important. Cole was arrested on a Friday morning. Cutter and 2 deputies and Holt's assistant rode to Cole's property at dawn, and Cole came out of his house in his housecoat and looked at the men in his yard and said nothing for a long moment, and then said very quietly, according to the deputy's account, "Who talked?" Cutter handed him the warrant. Cole looked at it. "You can't prove." "I can prove 14 separate incidents," Cutter said. "I have 3 witnesses to the assault on the Thorne property, documentation of your contact with a corrupt land office employee, and a sworn statement from a man who worked directly for you." He paused. "I've also got a letter from a woman who took the time to write everything down in language a judge can understand." Cole looked at the warrant for a long moment. Then he went inside and got dressed and came back out and got on the horse they'd brought for him, and he rode to the county seat between Cutter and the deputies without speaking again. Lydia found out about it the same way she'd found out about Marsh, through Clara, who rode out to the ranch herself instead of sending a message, which told Lydia the news was significant enough to deliver in person. She was in the yard when Clara came up the lane at a canter, and she knew from the way Clara was riding that it was over, or at least this part of it was. And she stood in the yard and waited, and when Clara got close enough to see her face, she called out, "He's in custody." And Lydia sat down on the porch step because her legs had apparently decided that was enough. Clara dismounted and sat beside her without ceremony, and they sat on the step together in the cold November morning and didn't say anything for a little while, which was the right thing, because some news needs a minute to become real before there's anything useful to say about it. "Marsh?" Lydia finally asked. "Charged with 3 counts. Holt negotiated. He's not walking away clean, but he's not facing what Cole's facing." Clara looked at her hands. "I think that's probably right." "I think so too." "Does Silas?" Lydia considered. "He'll take some time with it," she said. "But yes, eventually." Clara nodded. "Prudhomme?" "The man in the land office. He's been suspended pending a full review. Holt thinks there are at least 2 other counties where Cole had similar arrangements." She paused. "You started something bigger than you knew, Lydia." She thought about that. About the letter she'd written in the kitchen late at night while Silas slept in the loft and the fire was low, choosing each word with the care you give to things that need to last. She thought about the foreman's laugh in the factory. "Going west, are you? To marry some dirt farmer?" And about the $4 and the first letter and the stagecoach and Pruitt warning her, and every step of it, all the steps that had seemed like choices at the time and now looked more like a path she'd been walking toward without knowing. "I didn't start anything," she said. "I just wrote down what was already there." Clara gave her a look. "Don't minimize it." "I'm not minimizing. I'm being accurate." She looked at the land, east to the creek, north to the ridge, west to the cottonwood stand. The injustice was already there. The evidence was already there. Silas had been living inside it for 15 years. She paused. "I had different eyes. I came in without the weight of all that history, and I could see the shape of it clearly." "Different eyes," Clara said. "That's what an outsider brings sometimes. Not wisdom, just a view from a different angle." Clara was quiet for a moment, then, "Where is he?" "North pasture, fence work." Lydia almost smiled. "He does fence work when he needs to think." "Does he know?" "Not yet." Clara stood. "Go tell him. I'll make the coffee." She walked the north pasture with the news in her chest like something warm, and she found him where she'd known she'd find him, at the long stretch of fence where the posts needed replacing, working with the same precise economy he brought to everything with his hands. And she stopped a little distance away and watched him for a moment before he heard her, because she wanted to keep this image. Silas Thorne on his own land, working, the winter sky enormous behind him, and the mountains in the far distance, and the creek catching the light somewhere beyond the fence line. He turned when he heard her footsteps. She watched his face read hers. He put down the fencing tool. "Cole," he said. "In custody," she said. "Friday morning. Cutter served the warrant himself." He was still for a moment. Then he turned and looked at the fence post he'd been working, the partly driven post leaning at its angle in the frozen ground. And he put one hand on the top of it and stood there for a few seconds with his back to her. And she understood he needed those seconds, and she gave them to him. When he turned back, his face was not happy, not relieved in any simple way. It was the face of a man who has been holding a great weight for so long that putting it down doesn't feel like relief immediately. It just feels like the absence of familiar pain, and that takes some time to become something you recognize as good. 15 years, she said quietly. 15 years, he confirmed. She walked to him and he put his arms around her and she pressed her forehead against his jaw, and they stood in the cold pasture in the November light, and she felt him breathe. One long, deliberate breath that seemed to go all the way down to the parts of him that had been braced for so long they'd forgotten what unbraced felt like. It's not finished, he said into her hair. The legal process, the trial. I know. It'll take months, maybe longer, and the land claim has to be formally dismissed, and Silas. She leaned back to look at him. I know all of that. I've read all the documents. I know exactly what comes next and how long it takes. She held his eyes. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her. I know, he said. That's still... He stopped. The sentence ended somewhere she couldn't see, but she thought she understood where it went. That was still something he was learning to believe. That she wasn't going anywhere. That the thing between them was real and not temporary, not practical, not a survival arrangement that would end when the survival was no longer required. He was learning it the same way she'd learned frontier life. One day, one unexpected moment, one decision to stay at a time. Come back to the house, she said. Clara made coffee. He picked up his tools. Clara's here? She rode out with the news herself. Lydia took his arm, the easy, unself-conscious way they'd started moving together months ago without deciding to. She wanted to be there when you found out. He was quiet for a moment. That was kind of her. You have people, Silas, she said. You have more people than you think. He didn't respond to that directly, but his hand covered hers on his arm, and they walked back to the house together across the frozen ground. The trial lasted 11 days in February, and Lydia attended every session, sitting in the gallery with her notes and her careful handwriting and the particular focused attention that Holt's assistant had. By the third day, started coordinating with her directly, understanding that she had organized a clearer record of certain periods than anything the official investigation had managed to compile. Cole sat at the defense table and looked at the gallery on the second day and found Lydia's face and held her gaze for a long moment, and she held it back without looking away. And then he looked at Silas beside her, and something moved in his face that was not quite defeat, but was the shape that defeat makes right before it arrives. His lawyer was competent, and did what competent lawyers do in circumstances where the evidence is substantial, made arguments about procedure, challenged the documentation, questioned the credibility of witnesses who had made their own deals. It bought time. It didn't change the outcome. Garrett Cole was convicted on 8 counts. The land claim was formally dismissed. The Prudhomme connection brought down 3 additional cases in 2 neighboring counties that Holt had been building since the autumn, none of which Lydia had known she was setting in motion when she'd written her letter, which was the thing about careful record-keeping. You couldn't always see in advance what shape the truth would take when it finally had room to move. Marsh pleaded to the lesser charges and received a sentence that would take 18 months from his life. She thought about that sometimes, about what 18 months was supposed to accomplish, what it was meant to fix in a man who had been broken long before he'd done anything worth punishing. She didn't have a clean answer to it. She wasn't sure clean answers existed for situations that had gotten as tangled as Marsh's had. The day the verdict came in, Silas said almost nothing. He shook Cutter's hand outside the courthouse and nodded at Holt and said something brief to each of them that she was too far away to hear. And then he came to where she was standing on the courthouse steps and took her hand without a word, and they walked to where the horses were tied and rode home, and she let the silence be what it was. Not empty, not sad, just large, the size of a thing that had finally been set down after a very long time. They were almost home before he said anything. My father used to say that justice was just the law agreeing with what was already true, he said. He meant it as a criticism of the law. Was he right? Silas considered. Sometimes. And sometimes the law is the only thing that makes the truth matter to the people who'd rather ignore it. He looked at the road ahead. Today felt more like the second kind. It was, she said. It took the law to make Cole accountable. The truth was already there. He nodded slowly. You made the truth available, he said. That's different from just knowing it. She thought about that for the rest of the ride home. The baby came in March, on a night that couldn't decide between winter and spring, cold air, and a sky that smelled like mud and new grass at the same time. Clara was there, and Clara's sister-in-law who'd delivered half the children in the county, a solid woman named Ruth, who had hands that inspired confidence and a voice that brooked no argument, and Silas was outside the bedroom door for 8 hours doing things she could hear him doing through the wall, pacing for the first 2 hours. Then what sounded like he'd found something to fix. Then silence that she understood was him sitting very still with whatever the worst version of waiting felt like, for a man who had learned to endure most things, but had not yet learned to endure this. It was not easy. She hadn't expected it to be easy, and it wasn't. It was hard and long, and there was a point somewhere in the middle of it where she understood why women had always needed other women for this. Why no amount of courage or stubbornness or frontier competence was the right tool for what her body was doing, and Ruth's voice was exactly what needed to be there, steady and matter-of-fact, and refusing to make more of it than was necessary, or less of it than was true. When it was over, the room was loud for a moment in the specific way that rooms are loud when something has just arrived that wasn't in the world before. And then Ruth put the child in her arms, and the room went quiet, and Lydia looked at this person, this new person, red-faced and astonished and already trying to understand something about the light, and felt a thing she had no word for and didn't try to name. Clara opened the bedroom door. Silas came in and stopped 2 feet inside the door, the same 2 feet he'd stopped at when he'd first walked into Clara's store and looked at the woman he was going to marry. And he looked at Lydia and the child, and she watched his face do the thing it did so rarely, open, completely, without control, without walls, without the careful management of a man who had spent most of his life making sure nothing too important showed. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she turned the baby so he could see, and he looked at his son for a long time without speaking, and she watched him, and she thought, there it is. That's what was always under all the rest of it. He reached out one hand, big, scarred, the hands that had done violence and hard work and careful fence posts and frozen ground, and put one finger in the baby's grip, and the baby held it with the complete mindless certainty of something that doesn't know yet what the world is like, and therefore has no reason not to trust it completely. Henry, Lydia said. The name they'd agreed on in January, sitting at the kitchen table with the winter outside and the lamp between them. Henry for his father's middle name, which she'd asked for and he'd given her, quietly, like something he'd kept so long it surprised him to hand it over. Henry, Silas said. His voice had the texture of something that had been used hard for a long time and was being asked now to do a completely different kind of work. Clara left the room. Ruth left the room. They were alone, the 3 of them, in the bedroom where Lydia had slept that first night in a strange bed in a stranger's house. And outside was the March night with its argument between seasons, and inside was the lamp and the warmth and this new person who had Silas's hands already. She could see it, the same shape in the fingers. You're going to be terrible at this, she said, not unkindly. He looked at her. Probably. You're going to be too careful with him and then overcorrect and not be careful enough. And you're going to teach him things that aren't entirely appropriate for his age, because you'll forget how old he is, and you're going to sit up watching him sleep for the first month and deny that you did it. He was quiet for a moment. That's a detailed prediction. I know you, she said. He looked at her, at Henry, at her again. You do, he said, and said it like a thing he was still getting used to. Being known, having someone know him, having that be not a threat, but the steadiest thing in the room. We're going to be imperfect at this, she said, both of us. I know. And it's going to be enough. He looked at her for a long moment, this man who had spent 15 years being feared and had spent the last 8 months being known, and was holding his son's finger in a bedroom in Wyoming in the middle of a night that couldn't decide what season it was. And he said, yes, it is. Spring came fully in April, the way spring comes to that territory. Not gradually, but suddenly, like a door being opened, everything green almost overnight, and the creek running high and clear, and the south pasture doing what it always did in the good years, which was justify every hard thing about living on that particular piece of ground. They rebuilt the barn together, with lumber from the mill in the county seat, and help from 3 neighboring ranchers who showed up on a Saturday morning without being asked, which was the first indication Lydia had that the territory was beginning to take a different kind of notice of Silas Thorne. Not the old notice, not the wide berth, not the lowered voice, but something more ordinary and more valuable. The noticing of neighbors. She stood in the yard with Henry in a sling across her chest and watched 4 men build a barn wall, and thought about what it meant for a community to decide someone was worth showing up for. It was not a small thing. It was maybe the largest thing. The difference between being feared and being trusted was the willingness of people to show up, and these three men with their lumber and their tools and their easy Saturday morning competence were saying something that no one had said to Silas Thorne in a very long time. He knew it. She could tell by the way he worked alongside them, still quieter than the others, still more economical in his movement and his speech, still fundamentally himself, but with something loosened in him that she'd been watching loosen for months, the way a fist opens when it has finally decided there's nothing left it needs to be ready for. One of the ranchers, a man named Guthrie, with a red beard and 3 daughters and a habit of talking to himself while he worked, stopped beside Lydia during the noon break and looked at the half-built barn and said, without particular ceremony, "That man is different than he was a year ago." She looked at the barn, at Silas, eating a biscuit in the sun and listening to something Guthrie's brother was telling him with the expression of someone who is actually listening rather than waiting. "Yes," she said. "What changed?" She looked at Henry asleep against her chest, at the land, at the creek glinting in the distance, at the far ridge still carrying the last of the winter snow in its highest creases. "I think he stopped being the only one who knew what things cost," she said. Guthrie considered that, nodded. "That'll do it," he said, and went back to the barn. Oh. There is a particular moment in the late afternoon, in late spring, when the light on that ranch does something she had never seen it do anywhere else. It comes down from the northwest at an angle that catches the grass of the south pasture and makes it look like something that's generating its own glow from inside. And the ridge goes dark purple behind it, and the cottonwoods along the west boundary flicker silver in whatever breeze is coming down from the mountains. And the whole thing looks less like a piece of land that people have spent years fighting over and more like what it was before any of that. Just ground and sky and weather and the stubborn, beautiful fact of things that keep growing. She was standing at the fence line watching it one evening in May, Henry asleep in the house with Clara sitting nearby, when Silas came to stand beside her. They stood there for a while without speaking. "I got a letter today," he said. "From?" "A man in Colorado, rancher. He'd heard about the coal case through the territorial office. Apparently Holt mentioned my name in a report, and this man is dealing with something similar in his county." He paused. "He wanted to know how we'd managed it, what approach we'd taken." She looked at him. "What did you write back?" He was quiet for a moment. "I told him to talk to his wife." She almost laughed. "You didn't." "I wrote 3 drafts," he said. "The 4th one said, find someone you trust to help you see the shape of what's happening from the outside, and then document everything, and then use the legal channels before you use anything else. Because the legal channels are slower and more expensive and more frustrating, but what they produce is something that lasts." She looked at the pasture, at the light doing its late afternoon thing. "That's good advice." "I stole it," he said. "From you, mostly." She leaned her shoulder against his arm, and he shifted his weight toward her, the easy, unthinking lean of people who have learned each other's center of gravity. "When does Clara's sister come to help?" she asked. "Week after next, and I spoke to Guthrie. His oldest daughter has been wanting work. She's 15, capable. Clara vouches for her." "You arranged all that?" "You've been managing the house and the baby and the correspondence for 3 months, he said. "You needed help and you weren't going to ask for it." She started to say she would have asked eventually. She stopped, because it wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. And one of the things she'd learned in a year on this ranch was that honesty was not actually the natural impulse she'd always thought it was. It was a practice, a choice made over and over again, and it got easier with time, but it never got automatic. "Thank you," she said instead. "You don't have to thank me for—" "Silas, take the thank you." He took it. She felt him almost smile against the top of her head. The light moved. The pasture glowed and then softened. Somewhere along the creek, something was singing. Frog or bird, she still couldn't always tell in this country. The territory had its own language she was still learning. "Are you happy?" she asked. The question surprised him. She felt it in the slight change of his breathing. He didn't answer immediately, which meant he was taking it seriously rather than deflecting it, and she was glad because she'd meant it seriously. "I'm not sure I know what that means exactly," he said, finally. "Happy." He thought about it. I know that I don't wake up braced for the worst thing anymore. I know that when I see you, I don't have the habit of not having you. I know that when Henry makes a sound in the night, I get up to check and I'm not afraid of what I'll find. I'm just... He stopped. There, she said. That might be happy, he said. I'm not sure I have a comparison. She thought about what she would have said a year ago if someone had asked her what she wanted. She would have said safe. She would have said enough food and a roof and no one putting their hands on her. She would have said practical things, survival things, things measured in what they prevented rather than what they provided. She thought that was not wrong. Those things are real and they matter, and she did not have them for a long time, and having them now was not something she had started taking for granted. But there was something underneath the survival, something she hadn't known to want because she hadn't known it existed, and it was this: being in a place that was hers, with a person who was known to her and known by her, doing work that was real and hard and connected to something that would last beyond the day. I think I am, she said. Happy. I think this is what it is. He was quiet, then, good. The word was simple and complete and had something in it she'd been hearing more of lately. Something that sounded, if she had to name it, like relief. Like a man who had spent a long time uncertain whether he was the kind of person who was allowed to be responsible for someone else's happiness, and was slowly, imperfectly, becoming certain. Henry cried from the house, a short declarative sound that said he'd woken and found himself alone and had opinions about it. And she felt Silas move before she did, already turning toward the house, and she thought of what she'd said to him the night Henry was born. You're going to be terrible at this, and thought, I was right and I was wrong. He was not terrible at it. He was new to it, which was not the same thing at all. She followed him across the yard in the last of the evening light, and the door opened and the lamp was warm inside, and Clara's voice was already saying something soothing to Henry, and the house was full of the specific comfortable noise of people and life and ordinary chaos. And Silas went to his son without hesitating, without the careful management of a man who doesn't know if he's allowed, just went to him the way you go to things you've decided are yours. She stood in the doorway for a moment and watched. The frightened woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with a bag that held everything she owned had carried something with her that she hadn't known was valuable. Not the $4, not the Bible she never opened, but the specific courage of a person who has decided that the least terrible option is still an option, and who walks toward it with her spine straight and her hands ready and her eyes open. She had walked into danger and found that it wasn't the kind she'd been warned about. She had walked into hardship and found that it was the kind that built something rather than the kind that only took. She had walked into a marriage that was supposed to be practical and found that human beings are not, in the end, very good at keeping things from becoming more than they were supposed to be. And the feared man who had expected to die alone was holding his son in a warm room in Wyoming and looking at the child the way people look at things they did not expect to deserve, which is to say, like something they intend to take very good care of. She stepped inside, closed the door against the spring night. The ranch was quiet around them, east to the creek and north to the ridge and west to the cottonwoods, and the land that had cost so much to keep was theirs. And the future was long and uncertain and would have its own difficulties that they couldn't see yet from here. And none of that was the same as the difficulties that had come before, because the difference between carrying something alone and carrying something with someone who knows the weight of it is the difference between surviving and living. They were living. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.